Hi, everybody. I'm Cheryl Jacobs, Executive Vice President of AIA Miami and the Miami Center for Architecture and Design. And we're here to talk today about Active Design Miami at our Fit City 6. Can't believe it's our sixth program. We stopped for a while, like everyone, due to the pandemic, but we're starting up again. And also we wanted to talk to you about what we're doing now and the work that we're doing. We have a great program today. We're going to start with Marta Viciedo and myself a little bit talking about what Active Design is and the project that we've been working on in collaboration with the Florida Department of Health. And then we're going to hear from the fabulous George Damian De La Paz, who's with the Miami-Dade County Mayor's Office. And we'll have a little break, and then we will have a panel moderated by Joanna Lombard, professor at the University of Miami School of Architecture. And our panelists will be Valerie Augustin, an architect who's going to be calling in from California, DNA Architecture, Hernan Guerrero Applewhite, founder of Geo Urban, and doing a lot of other things, and co-chair of our Urban Design Committee, and Elizabeth Plater-Zybert, FAIA co-founder of DPZ Co-Design. That will be an amazing panel. So with that, Marta.
All righty. Hello. There we go.
Hello.
Yes. Hello. Hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Marta Viciedo. I am the co-founder of Urban Impact Lab, and I am the project manager for the Active Design Miami effort twice now. It's been a fantastic journey in figuring out how to best structure design and policy strategies for our community. Kudos to Cheryl Jacobs for having the foresight to see these strategies kind of coming to life in New York, and then realizing that we really needed them here in Miami. So with that, I'm going to share my screen, and God willing,
you have to finish that, and the creek don't rise. So
all right, so looks like everything looks good. For everybody. All right, so I'm gonna actually just turn it over to Cheryl just a little bit. She talked about this, but if you want to do some quick introduction, Cheryl.
Sure. So for those of you that are new to the concept, or to our project, let me say, we started working with our team and the Florida Department of Health in 2017 to create active design guidelines. The AIA chapter in New York did a project, active design project with the city of New York. And I learned about it and thought it was an amazing concept and wanted to bring it here to Miami. And so I got involved with the Consortium for a Healthier Miami-Dade and the Health and the Built Environment Committee, and long story long, I guess, sorry. We were able to work with the Florida Department of Health in Miami-Dade County through a grant that they received from the Centers for Disease Control. And we created 69 policies and strategies for healthier living, frankly. And I was lucky to be able to connect with Marta at that time and hired her to be the project manager. Since then, she's developed this amazing Urban Impact Lab, but we're always looking for opportunities to partner. And last year, the Florida Department of Health reached out. They received another grant, and they wanted us to do a supplement. And here we are. We're actually almost finished. So it's been a really wonderful process in bringing in people from the community, architects, planners, city officials, and community activists to help us in developing this continuation of Active Design Miami. So with that, I think, Marta, we can move forward a little bit. Again, as I said, thanks to the Florida Department of Health. And unfortunately, our liaison could not be here this morning, but we're recording this, so we'll give it to them, and hopefully we have some people from the consortium or the Health and Built Environment Committee online today. Next.
Yes, so I'm going to walk us through what active design is, and then so we'll talk about the entire body of work, and then we'll delve a little deeper, but not too deeply, into the new body of work, so that everybody attending gets an idea of what's been done and where we're going. Active Design Miami and the set of work is really a set of evidence-based policy and design strategies that are designed to lead to positive health outcomes for our entire community. The entire body of work is based on several principles, with the premise that physical, mental, and social health are interconnected. The design strategies are all, they're committed to making sure that we prioritize safety, because we know that when people feel safe, then they are more willing to engage in healthy activity. They're more willing to get out there, take a bike ride, take a walk, even if it's just around their neighborhood. The strategies are also inclusive. The entire body of work is inclusive and designed to be equitable. It's actually one of our core values. And that's so that all of the design strategies, can serve individuals of all ages and backgrounds and abilities. And it's not just wholly focused on physical health, but also the social interactions that support overall well-being. Active design as a body of work is also committed to making sure that people have access to healthy food and clean drinking water and all of the nutrition that is necessary for supporting community health in general. And finally, active design is committed as well to information and knowledge sharing so that people feel empowered and informed and engaged in the process of designing their community or setting policies or interacting with local officials and decision makers. Last but not least, active design is centered around sustainability. We know that when we conserve our natural resources and we protect them, that has a direct connection to how well our community will do from a health standpoint. So our environment is directly connected to our physical health as well. And so all of these elements, if you will, are essentially the core values around which all of the strategies were designed. So back in 2017, Cheryl and I went into our closet and we found the two most loudest clashing blouses that we could find. But we also worked together to develop the first publication that she alluded to in her introduction. The result was a set of 69 design and policy strategies. They are designed to take and to really take into account Miami's unique environment and our diverse population. They really embrace our local initiatives and priorities. So we're thinking about how Miamians like to be outdoors and our access to waterfront spaces and how that might play a role in supporting community health, but also, our very culturally diverse community and what would be needed to support health from a vantage point of, a completely Spanish speaking community or Creole speaking community or whatever the case might be, make sure that they had the information that they needed. All of the strategies respond to our unique opportunities and challenges. And I would say even with the new body of work, that's even more so because we're looking at really specific challenges and obstacles for Miami-Dade's context. And then finally, the entire body of work was guided by a collaborative process. And so that meant we worked and we continue to work around, or rather together with a number of partners. A lot of them have joined our advisory council. Perhaps they're supporting us with information or guidance or whatever the case might be. But we've been working since the beginning with individuals from the education sector, from the health sector, obviously, but from community foundations, from the business world or the economic development and community development world, government. So really looking at how we can design these strategies, both how we did it in the past and how we can continue doing this so that it's the most collaborative and open process possible. The entire body of work, the initial body of work, was centered around 4 areas of opportunity. Really looking at the 4 core pillars of development in our community. So parks and open spaces, development patterns, transportation and mobility, and building. So when we're thinking about parks and open spaces, we're thinking about all of the elements that make parks and open spaces accessible and encourage physical activity. And as you might guess, some of those things are really, in some ways, they just make common sense, right? They're making sure that pathways are completed and that they're in good working order, ensuring that there is shade, that there is access to features like bathrooms and water fountains, and making sure that parks, any programs can support a number of different activities, but also a number of different abilities and folks from different age groups. On the development pattern side of things, we're looking at how we build a community and that is connected to parks, how we make sure that the connections between a neighborhood, if you will, and their parks and their transportation corridors, how those connections are solidified and are really optimized to make sure that individuals can navigate a neighborhood, live where they want to live, but also have access to physical activity just outside their door. Transportation and mobility really looks at mobility corridors and modalities and how we make getting around as easy but also and safe, but also as encouraging of active transportation as possible. So how do we encourage greater bike riding? How do we encourage additional walking? Even something as simple as how do you encourage going up stairs for maybe the first flight or two versus taking an elevator, which actually leads me directly into buildings, because that's an example out of the buildings category. How do you design it so that you walk into a building and you're really encouraged to just take the stairs for the first floor or two? Maybe we're not going to make you go upstairs for 20 stories or encourage you or ask you to do that, but really looking at opportunities to just increase the amount of incidental activity that you would find throughout your day, and add to your step count, add to the amount of places where you're being active. In 2017, in addition to creating the body of work, and it's all evidence-based, so a lot of research went into that. We also were tasked with making sure that our local governments, or certain parts of our local government, were adopting the work. So as you all know, we have Miami-Dade County, and we have about 35 cities within Miami-Dade County. We had the county itself adopted Active Design Miami as via a resolution, and then we have 9 additional cities adopted as well. So we did lots of presentations, worked with either city planning departments or maybe the city manager's office to introduce the concept, to work with them to see how they would integrate it into things like the city's comprehensive development master plan, or maybe a mobility plan. When we work with cities, we never ask them to adopt all 69 strategies. That's not the goal, and to by force enact them immediately. The goal is for cities to look at the body of work and say, okay, we can prioritize. We can look at the next 5 or 10. We can take this in a phased approach and begin integrating as piece by piece as it makes sense to the cities. That allows the cities a lot of flexibility in order to move forward with including this in their designs and policy work. But it's also cumulative. So the more strategies they end up incorporating, the greater their community health outcomes will be. And so we often work with them to ensure that they understand that, obviously, but also that they can pick and choose and feel flexible to, or just feel the autonomy to move forward in the way that makes sense. And in addition, there's some guidelines that talk about water access, access to the bay, and obviously not every city within Miami-Dade County has access to the bay. So some guidelines don't always apply to every single municipality. And we understand that, and that makes sense. So it's been a great process being able to pinpoint the particular priorities within our communities. So I'm going to jump into the work that we're doing now that technically began in late 2021, but is really the bulk of it has been done through 2022. I want to give a shout out to the wonderful team behind, of course, Cheryl, Catherine Dos Santos Alves, who has been doing amazing work in pushing this forward, and really everybody on the advisory council, too many to list right now, but everybody that has really given their time and attention to support this work. So the new body of work consists of essentially 2 supplements, and nothing that we're doing now in any way takes the place of the original body of work. It is simply adding to, so they're additive features to further either the impact or further the reach that active design and the strategies associated with it can have. So the first supplement is structured around health equity. For the purposes of our work, we did a lot of research and thinking about what exactly is health equity. And we landed on this definition, which is actually we're completely adopting it from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. It did such a good job in articulating what health equity is. And simply put, it means that everyone has a fair and just opportunity to be as healthy as possible. As part of this definition, I'd like to call attention to the second line, particularly the first few words that says that this requires removing obstacles to health. So for this body of work, we really focused on what could be obstacles. And a lot of times in everything that we've done previously, we've always focused on opportunities. Even now, we're still focused on opportunities, but sometimes in order to really move forward an issue around equity, we also have to realize that it's not simply an additive process. It's not simply just making more policy or more strategies. It's also eliminating things that have gotten in the way of individuals that maybe are in poverty or have racially diverse, or other situations that really that there are issues that have policy issues, design issues that have stood in the way of them being able to have the most fair and most just opportunity to be as healthy as they can be. So as you might imagine, this opens an entirely, it's an entire huge universe of challenges and issues to contemplate. We can think about affordable housing. We can think about just pay. We can talk about so many directions when we're thinking about health equity. So the new supplement will now, with the new supplement, we're also looking at the intersection between health equity and physical health, and how active design specifically can make those bridges, taking into account that there's social and emotional, mental health as well to play with. So when we're looking at the health equity piece, we're looking at how do we remove the instances where people feel like they cannot access a public park, or maybe they feel like they shouldn't be there. Sometimes it's as simple as paying close attention to ensuring that all the items or all the infrastructure within a park space is open and operational and accessible to everyone, and removing the obstacles that create a barrier for anyone to not just use the space, but feel welcome and feel encouraged to be there
and feel
for as
safe.
long as they might want. What was that?
And feel safe.
Yes, and feel safe. So if you're it really there's so many scenarios that I could bring up, but that's really the core of the work. And so that will actually, the final set of strategies around this will be coming out in just a few weeks. So we're excited about this work, and we also give kudos to the Department of Health. This was their framework going in, looking at health equities, looking at communities that in some ways were underserved, or had limited access to health. So we give kudos to the Department of Health for being willing to step into this space, because it's not always comfortable.
Absolutely. And we were actually given zip codes to look at, which I found really interesting. I never, some zip codes stretch over different neighborhoods, but we're such an area of neighborhoods and variety. And so they, as part of our work, they identified a series of zip codes that they wanted us to particularly look at.
Exactly. Thank you for mentioning that, Cheryl. The Department of Health did do some pre-work, so they weren't zip code selected at random or anything like that. They did assessments on communities that felt in some way, the individual members felt either disempowered, they felt like they had limited access or no access to certain things, or they had feelings of not being safe. Perhaps they had feelings of sadness that were higher in certain zip codes than others. And so they took all of that into account and created sort of a guideline, if you will, framework for us to begin our work. But truthfully, all of the work is applicable and important to all of Miami-Dade County, which is really wonderful. The second supplement is really organized around emerging threats, and I couldn't think of a more timely topic or set of topics to look at as we're thinking about physical health, because it really isn't going to be possible for, I happen to live very close to Little Havana, and so Jose Marti Park at this time of the year, and very many number of days during this time of the year due to king tides, is severely flooded. And so when you think of a park like Jose Marti Park, where so many parents rely on the park because after school programs are happening there. And we're talking about, probably hundreds of kids at the park at the same time in the afternoon. Families go there for just active and passive recreation. There's 2 workout stations at the park, and all of the use and the needs that that park meets. And then you think about it being flooded and largely inaccessible, and in some ways very dangerous, because at this point it floods so intensely that the seawall itself becomes completely inundated. So you don't see the barrier between the Miami River and the park. And when you're thinking about little kids running around, or really just anybody, if you're not 100% familiar, or you're just not completely paying attention, it's really easy to put a number of individuals in a really precarious and unsafe situation. And so we also, this was a framework that was provided to us for the Department of Health, but we couldn't be more happy to be looking at this, because we understand, Cheryl has certainly always understood the importance of putting sustainability first and addressing our most pressing needs. So when we're looking at emerging threats, I spoke a lot about flooding, and that definitely is under the climate crisis mitigation category. We're also looking at heat risk, which, as many of you, anybody that spends any time in Miami during the summer, we realize how difficult it is, and it is becoming, to stay active at any time of the day during the summer, and our summers are long. And of course you could do stuff inside, but nothing compares to being outside, getting fresh air. And not everybody has all of the space and the equipment necessary to be active indoors all the time. So we're really looking at how heat risk can be mitigated, and can really be more attention brought to this via active design. Working very closely also with our chief heat officer at Miami-Dade County, who's Jane Gilbert, and she's doing some great work at the county as well. But really doubling down on how this has an effect on everybody, but particularly younger adults, older adults, even our pets, anybody with certain health risks, and how we might make some impactful suggestions, strategies, how we might make some impactful moves to mitigate heat risk moving forward. Also looking at water and air quality, because the link between the quality of the water we drink, the air that we breathe, and our ability to remain active and healthy, they're kind of inseparable. The other set of, the other sections underneath emerging threats is public health crisis adaptation. And that's really looking at, okay, so we all collectively went through this historic and chaotic and life-changing period with the COVID pandemic. And we can't turn a blind eye to the fact that that situation might come up again. So how do we harness our shared understanding? How do we take our learnings and apply it forward? And if you will, codify it, right? So that there is a way for all of us in our community to make sure that we can manage. I mean, we're not going to prevent future pandemics outright, but how can we manage them as best as possible? And then finally, resilience to severe weather. Now, there is severe weather associated with the climate crisis, for those of you that know anything about climate change, but really looking at severe weather in and of itself, and how we might better prepare our communities and put policy and design strategies in place so that when severe weather instances occur, we're not completely starting from zero in terms of supporting our community health, or we're not, any gains are wiped off. So that's really that third focus area. What we're doing right now, like what's coming up immediately, is that by the end of October, which is coming up very soon. Our final, the final strategies, the information around the new supplements will be published. And then moving forward, we will be continuing our municipal outreach and engagement, really focusing on those communities that were, that are underserved in some ways, but also doubling down on the communities that originally adopted active design, making sure that they are well informed and able to incorporate the information in the new supplements. Something that's particularly exciting is that we're also working on a pilot project. So we are looking for an opportunity to enact a pilot based on at least one of the strategies. And so for this, we've chosen heat risk, and we're in the early mid-ish days of developing, fully fleshing out what a pilot project might look like that can help serve the purpose of helping our community members better navigate the heat risk that they face, and that seems to be, by all projections, will be increasing over the coming years and decade. And finally, we will be continuously providing technical assistance and information sharing. So we have a blog where we're often sharing stories or sharing information. There's a social media page, but also going one-on-one, not just to municipalities, but also design firms that want to know more, want to know how to incorporate this work into the work that they're doing. And so that will be continuing on an ongoing basis. And last but not least, we want to invite everybody here to join us in this collaborative process. And there's 3 immediate opportunities that you can do just that. The Miami Center for Architecture and Design hosts a housing affordability committee. I'll let Cheryl talk about that in just a moment, but that's an awesome opportunity to get involved. If you would like to be informed or work with us on the pilot project, we invite you to join the advisory council. We meet every other month, more or less, so it's not an oppressive amount of work or meetings, but you are welcome to help us shape the pilot project, find opportunities to expand it, and get it going. And then finally, we would love for you to follow us and share our information. Our contact information is right on the screen. You can email cheryl@miamicad.org at any point. activedesignmiami.org is the website, and Active Design Miami for Instagram is where you'll find lots of updates. Cheryl, let me turn it back over to you to cover anything I missed or anything you want to touch base on.
Thanks, Marta. You can hear me, right? Yes, I just wanted to make sure I hadn't muted myself. For as long as we've been doing Zoom, right? We still have to tell each other to unmute. So I wanted to let you know a little bit about our Housing Affordability Committee. One of our speakers coming up, Hernan Guerrero, has been very active in that. And we've been doing workshops with stakeholders and with people in the communities that have been in our different organizations that are doing work around housing affordability. And we've been putting on programs to talk about issues within the community and how we can help developers and building more and cities and building more affordable housing, how we can look at ways to save money. And so we've been working very closely with Miami-Dade County and George Damien De La Paz, who will be on very soon, and to try and push the needle. And I think the reason we started doing this also is there are so many organizations that are doing a lot of great work in this area, and there are things being built and developed, but people don't know about it. And I think that that's one of the best things that we can do as an organization is get the word out there and, bring all these people together that are working. We all tend to do work in our silos and don't always think, it's not intentional, but don't always think to reach out to collaborate. And I'm a true believer that if we make the effort to collaborate, we can get so much more done. So we've been, that's one of our big goals, is to bring all these groups together. So we've been doing that, and we have actually 4 committee chairs, because they are also wonderful. Tim Blair with AECOM, Sandra Suarez with Perkins and Will, and Mark, in addition to Hernan, of course, and Mark Marine, who is at FIU and is the director of the FIU by Design program. So they're really great organizations to be moving this work forward. And we do have a very active Instagram. I hope that you can reach out and follow us. And when you post things that relate to housing affordability, to active design, maybe you don't even call it that, or resiliency and sustainability, any of these issues that are so important, health equity, emerging threats, tag us. So we're happy to repost. The other thing is, and I'm not going to try and pull up the website because it'll mess up our Zoom, and I don't want to take any chances of doing that. But we have a really great website that has, it's not, we can call it a blog, but it's not an interactive blog. It's stories that we post for on all kinds of issues. We just had a great post from Barbara Guerrero, who's executive director of Dream and Green, about teaching young people in the schools about active design. Barbara is now chair of the Health and the Built Environment Committee for the consortium. And we have a really great post by Kathy De Santos Alves on pets and heat and how to protect your pets that are outside from heat. So please take a look at that. And if you and your organization, if you have something that's going on that you'd like us to share or want to do an article, it really is short, 300 to 500 words. It's not a huge, not too much writing. Let me know and send it to me with pictures, and we can post it. We love sharing that and sharing the work that our collaborators are doing. So I think that we're running really, really short. And so I wanted to let you know, I'm on my iPad at home. That's why I don't have a background and you see my artwork behind me. But we do have a Q&A and a chat. So I wanted to, I did get one question from Maria Cadena. Was addition of more trees and open spaces and sidewalks something that was looked into? And yeah, you wanted to, yeah. Absolutely. And I know Marta can address that in more detail.
Maria, thank you for asking that question. I am a self.
You're a tree hugger.
Tree hugger. I know. I'm trying. I am. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but definitely a tree hugger. And we couldn't notwithstanding my personal opinions about trees, truthfully, all of the evidence in doing, or all of the research and the evidence in doing this work and looking at heat mitigation and looking at how to to address air and water quality really had the entire team. It didn't take a lot to convince us, but it was just a little bit mind-blowing how trees are really the superheroes here. Making sure that we as a community are increasing or taking intentional and active steps to increase our tree canopy can and will have an outsized impact on how well we navigate things like community health, heat, resilience, managing our air quality, all of it. And so we cannot sing the praises of trees enough. It's not an oversimplification by any stretch, and we understand that there are instances where it can be more complicated than we want it to be. But planting the right trees, obviously the right trees, and making sure that we're expanding our tree canopy is an enormous step that we can take collaboratively together, but also as individuals to ensure that that so much of our community health, so much of our community as a whole can look into the future and deal with the challenges that may be coming. We have I think a comment from Beatrice Baldan, who says increase the tree canopy is it also increases biodiversity, and that's absolutely true. Again, really important when you're thinking about the interconnectedness of all things and a holistic approach to sustainability and health. And then Angie Ortiz said, I'm really interested in this topic. I would like to know if you have any internships. And Angie, I think the best route is if you would email Cheryl, and I'll pop over to the other screen, Cheryl at miamicad.org. I think that there definitely may be some opportunities. I'll let Cheryl jump in, but there's all sorts of opportunities that we can explore.
Absolutely. I'm actually looking for some interns now. So send me an email and we can talk. Any other questions on or comments in the chat or the Q&A? So we're running really short because we're fast talkers. So Marta, if you want to stop sharing, and then I'm going to ask Joanna Lombard to come back on. And Marta, you stay there, don't go away.
Hi, sorry about that.
Hey, Joanna.
I see that Jorge is with us too, but I just wanted to say really quickly, people that are on the chat or people who are with us, Million Trees Miami is a very strong advocate, and Gabby Lopez, who runs that program in the Parks Department, Miami-Dade County Parks Department, you can contact them and tell them our neighborhood needs trees, and they will work to get trees planted. So they've done tree plantings on blocks and for other neighbors. And I would just encourage everybody, if you see an area that says this is really in need of some street trees or some planting, to reach out to them, because she's terrific. And their goal is to increase the tree canopy in Miami-Dade County by 30%. So we have a lot to do together to get to that point. Marta, you may want to say more about that, though.
No, it's actually a fantastic suggestion. Yeah, without taking up more time, I know everything that Joanna said, absolutely. And of course, we can all follow up offline if you just reach out to Cheryl or via social media.
And then I would just add one more plug before we go to Jorge, which is that the team that I work on in with the Department of Public Health at the Miller School of Medicine, we've been doing studies on tree canopy for a long time now, starting with the Miami-Dade County Medicare beneficiaries. And it's just so striking, the levels of disease burdens that are so much higher in neighborhoods with low tree canopy. And this is true across all income areas, but it has a very strong impact in low income neighborhoods. So higher levels of tree canopy are associated with lower levels of heart disease, lower levels of even Alzheimer's and dementia. So we're taking this study to compare Miami and San Diego, and we're looking at northern Manhattan as well. So there's a huge medical benefit, which is, the kind of foundation of Fit City. But then there are also social benefits. Mardell Shipley at Cornell has done some really interesting studies on lower levels of violence and crime in neighborhoods, higher levels of social connectedness. So if you look at them from a resilience, a climate, and a health benefit, Marta, you're right to be a major fan of trees, because they definitely are our partners in a better world. So I'll sign off so that you can go ahead and flip over to George.
Hey, George.
Good morning.
Good morning. How are you? It's good to see you.
Good to see you. Happy to be here.
Thank you so much, everybody. George Damien De La Paz with Mayor Daniela Levine Cava's office, senior advisor to brilliant things. I can never remember your exact title, but we're very lucky to have a great partnership with the mayor's office and with George particularly in working on a lot of the different projects that we do around housing affordability and health and the built environment. So with that, I'm going to let you take it away. And we're set up, so whenever you're ready, you can share your screen.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that generous introduction. So again, my name is George. I'm with Mayor Levine Cava's office. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. I also want to thank all the panelists and participants for their time. My background is in housing policy, urban planning, and civic tech, and I help lead the mayor's affordable housing initiatives. And today, I'm going to provide a quick recap of our latest affordable housing efforts, and then go through a slide deck that touches on some of the ways that we have incorporated active design strategies into our affordable housing developments. As many of you know, housing has been a long-standing issue in our community. For years, Greater Miami has consistently ranked as one of the least affordable metropolitan areas in the country. That trend has only worsened during the pandemic. We're now seeing rapid price increases and growing redevelopment pressures across the county. To meet this challenge, this administration has taken new steps to provide distressed residents with immediate relief, while at the same time working to aggressively expand the supply of affordable and workforce housing. Over the last few months, we have worked with the Board of County Commissioners and other civic leaders to craft new tenant protections. We assembled a novel $80 million impact pool made up of private and nonprofit capital to accelerate the development of affordable housing. We launched our first Office of Housing Advocacy to prevent displacement, train tenants on their rights, and connect residents with housing services. And we also successfully distributed over $100 million in emergency rental relief to keep lower income tenants in their homes. This quarter alone, we have more than 4,000 county-owned, county-funded affordable units in some stage of construction, from pre-development to completion. We have committed to getting at least 18,000 additional units in financial closing by the end of next year. We've already completed over 2,000 new affordable housing units since the start of this administration. And many of those units have been completed through the redevelopment of our aging public housing sites, which have become substandard due to decades of deferred maintenance. We've been rebuilding these properties into new mixed income, mixed use developments with unit for unit replacement and a guaranteed right of return for affected residents, while at the same time adding thousands of additional units within those underused parcels. Finally, a few weeks ago, the board approved the mayor's proposed budget, which invests $500 million for affordable housing programs to serve residents across the income spectrum. So now I'm going to pull up a slide deck that goes a little deeper into our affordable housing investments. and then outline how we are using housing to create healthier communities. So the county recently approved the mayor's proposed $10 billion budget, which included $5 million in funding to build or repair affordable rental and homeownership opportunities. On top of that, the mayor launched a new $85 million housing initiative called HOMES. It's an acronym for a 5-point plan. H stands for housing preservation, O is for opening new doors through innovative programs, M is for mortgage relief, E is for expanding emergency rental assistance, and S is for securing new units. And I'll quickly touch on each element. For H, housing preservation, we are committing $9 million to help builders acquire and renovate older apartment buildings. We also put out $3 million for a weatherization assistance program to help homeowners make their homes more energy efficient through new repairs, insulation, and appliances. For O, opening new doors through innovative programs, we worked with Commissioner McGee to create a new incentive program to provide relief to workforce renters and home buyers. We also created a $5 million incentive program focused on the Section 8 program to encourage landlords to take Section 8 voucher holders. With the recent price increases, it's been really difficult for Section 8 voucher holders to find an available unit. And with this program, we'll provide landlords with a $2,000 incentive to accept the lease of a Section 8 voucher holder. For mortgage relief, we committed $25 million to help struggling homeowners. This funding can support homeowners behind on their mortgage, insurance, HOA fees, or utility payments. This program will also include targeted outreach to senior and disabled residents. For E, expanding rental assistance, we dedicated $8 million to expand emergency rental assistance support up to workforce levels. Finally, for S, securing new units, I'm really excited about this. We created a new development inflation adjustment fund. This is a $15 million fund that will be used to help close out projects that have been delayed by the pandemic and supply chain issues. We also dedicated around $16 million to the Homeless Trust to create new supportive housing opportunities for the homeless population. So to recap, this plan cuts across population groups and covers a variety of housing needs. Even more importantly, this $85 million package does not cover the entire universe of affordable housing investments in this budget. Right, the budget also includes new staffing, the Office of Housing Advocacy to handle the volume of constituent calls. We're creating a $3 million eviction prevention program to provide free legal support to tenants at risk of eviction. We also unlocked $9 million in funding for the Affordable Housing Trust Fund to finance the development of affordable rental and homeownership opportunities. To wrap up, I wanted to recap some of the ways that we have been using active design in affordable housing. For example, the county has been more proactive about expanding the supply of affordable housing along our public transit corridors. Here's an underused county-owned parking space abutting the Brownsville Metro Station. Only about 15 to 30 of the 300 parking spaces you see here were used on a typical day. And we transformed this site into a 500-unit affordable housing complex, which increased ridership at that station by more than 30%. More recently, we converted the Northside Metro parking station to a 400-unit affordable housing complex. As of this quarter alone, we have more than 600 units of new county-funded transit-oriented development projects in progress, including Platform 3750, which will add new units along the Douglas Metro Station. We have Quail Roost Transit Village, which is just off the South Day Transit Way. Construction just started up on that 140-unit development. We're adding new units by the Okeechobee Metro Station, Hialeah. We're adding a new phase to the Brownsville project that I showed you earlier. As I mentioned before, the mayor is committed to getting 18,000 additional affordable and workforce housing units in financial closing by the end of next year. Most of those units, around 70% of them, are being built or reserved near a transit corridor. On the South Corridor alone, we have about 5,000 units in some stage of construction, which will be coming online shortly. The county's also been in the process of renovating and redeveloping its aging public housing supply. So most of the county's public housing units are over 40 years old. These properties lack central AC. They are substandard due to decades of deferred maintenance. They require substantial upgrades to their elevator, electrical, plumbing, and mechanical systems. None of these developments would meet current hurricane standards. So we've been in the process of drawing down federal funds to renovate and redevelop those sites. Again, keeping existing tenants with unit for unit replacement for the public housing, while at the same time maximizing these sites which have been underused as of right. So here's the terribly named senior housing complex. Here it is now. We've been adding additional units. We've renamed it River Park. We've added 2,000 new affordable and workforce units to this site, creating a new mixed-use, mixed-income housing complex. It's a $600 million project. It's one of the largest mixed-income public housing redevelopments in county history. And with new site planning, we're being more intentional, right? We're able to include new green space in this site and a brand new river walk as well as additional amenities like this gym, which is used by various residents. Here's the original Barton Find Villas, which was located in that same parcel, but it was still the senior housing complex. It was a 3-story building constructed in 1979 and included 50 units of affordable housing with a large exterior ramp. Here's a site after we redeveloped it into a new 7-story, 100-unit affordable housing complex. This site is really unique. Because of resident input, the developer incorporated a 7-story, 8-foot wide indoor ramp. This is something that senior and disabled residents were asking for. It's a really unique feature. I don't think you could find any type of ramp at that scale at any of the public housing in the country. And it's fascinating. So residents use this because they preferred the convenience of the ramp over elevators, and it serves as an emergency measure, but also even social infrastructure. Residents use this ramp for exercise, for social gathering, and again, it's really emblematic of what we could do when we receive and incorporate public feedback into our housing design. The mayor's also incorporated committed resources to build active urban trails, like the underlined Ludlam Trail, the latest budget. Ludlam Trail, as you know, is an abandoned railroad track running between Miami International Airport and Dadeland Mall. One of the things we've been really intentional about is adding affordable housing along these trails. This is one of the mistakes I think that the High Line made, right? They weren't as intentional about equity and inclusion and thinking about the development of affordable housing along these amenities. So we've been more proactive. And here we have a new county-funded affordable housing development dedicated to seniors, which we made up of 2 5-story buildings connected by a pedestrian bridge right off the corridor. And we have another 84-unit workforce housing project in the works nearby. And this is really important. We've been trying to bake these active design measures in our annual affordable housing solicitation. So every year, the county puts out as a competitive bidding process around $25 million in gap funding to build affordable rental and homeownership housing. So there's a lot of flexibility here because we're able to change the scoring rubrics to encourage certain types of developments. And we've been really intentional about adding additional preference points for building affordable housing near transit corridors. We've also baked in longer-term considerations to prepare for future shocks and stresses, such as providing additional incentives to ensure our housing is prepared for sea level rise, including elevating properties and flood-proofing them. We've also added additional design preferences for disabled residents. We've also baked in mandatory requirements to green building certification. That is now required for any county-funded affordable housing unit coming online. Same thing with internet access. Broadband internet is now required for all county-funded affordable housing. So you're seeing that we're being really proactive to make these transactions more equitable and accessible in a really forced way, right? Because this is required to draw down the funds. So I'll close out there, and I look forward to any of your questions.
Hey, George, thank you so much. You're actually, you can unmute yourself. There you are. I think it's really great for everyone to know the kinds of things that the county is doing, because it doesn't seem to get out there. I mean, there may be like a big splash with an article in the Herald or something, but then that's it. So doing this kind of thing, I think, is really important to share what you're doing and, oh, sorry, my assistant got in the way there. And, I think that even though it's going to be a few years before the stuff is usable and available, at least we're heading in that direction. And I think that is a fantastic thing that your group and the mayor is making happen. I'm not sure. Thanks, Marta. I'm not sure if we have any questions. Other than Marta was just saying what an amazing presentation. Are there any questions out there for George?
There's a question from Beatrice about
ahead.
the decarbonization in terms of tearing things down and building things new as opposed to repurposing old buildings. And her second point is if you could talk about the ratio between rental and home ownership.
Okay, so we are doing both with our public housing. We are preserving or renovating some of the existing structures. So at River Park, for example, one of the large buildings in the middle, Robert King High, we renovated the building, got it up to code, kept all the existing tenants, but at the same time, some of these buildings just could not, even with the renovation, be too costly. So it was actually more cost effective to completely tear them down and rebuild them. And again, with better site planning, right? We're actually improving those sites as a result of it, which I think is fundamental. So I showed you Martin Fine Villas, terrible, barrack style housing, 3 stories, 50 units. We added 50 additional units by rebuilding it and added this amazing amenity that residents wanted, right? A 7-story ramp. And again, making this routine, doing this across the county and all of our public housing. So in terms of the ratio for rental and homeownership, that's a really interesting question and it's complicated. Miami's heaviest need is on the rental side, and we are aggressively increasing the supply, as I mentioned before, at least 18,000 units in the pipeline. That'll be a financial closing by next year. We're trying to do more. But we also recognize that our homeownership rate's been in steady decline since 2008, right? The county never fully recovered, particularly for Black and Hispanic homeowners. So we are trying to be more proactive and think about what are ways that we could do homeownership differently, understanding that single family homes with a deep setback are just not sustainable, right? How can we do multifamily homeownership opportunities? And we're actively encouraging that as well in our solicitations. Mid-scale housing, thinking about affordable condos. Some of those preference points that I mentioned before about thinking about sea level rise, we incorporate that in our affordable homeownership RFPs, which is really important, right? So we're taking a long range approach. And again, not just doing this as like a major initiative, that's baked in to any application that a developer puts into to acquire these funds. And I think that's the best way to get more sustainable and focused change.
That's great. Joanna, I can't see the Q&A.
Yeah,
So-
I'm watching it. That's okay. Yeah. Stephen Park wants to know, he asked if the ramp was an interior enclosed exit ramp. So it could be used for a fire ramp, right? I think you said it was, George. Yeah.
Yeah, that's correct. It's so it connects to the outdoor area. The initial building, the ramp is completely on the exterior. So it's fascinating that we included as an indoor corridor, residents more comfortable using the elevator in terms of emergency, but also just think of this, like with extreme heat risks. Now this is a social infrastructure embedded within the building, covered by AC, you have shade, and residents use it to exercise together. It's incredibly charming to see in practice. And again, you will not find that anywhere else. In fact, it was a massive cost to the developer, right? This is not something that was initially baked in to the plan, but during the civic engagement process, they were receiving public input from the residents that lived there before. They're like, look, we have this ramp, we don't want to lose it, but we want to make it better, right? Completely exterior wasn't meeting their needs, so we actually embedded it in the middle of the building.
So let me ask if it's okay, Cheryl, I just want to, this is one more, this is coming in from Beatrice, but I'm going to change it a little bit. So Beatrice, I hope you're okay with this. She talks about the fact that, you don't have to tear things down and the smart building system. And I wonder, her question leads me to ask you a little bit about the concern that some neighbors and neighborhoods and cities and municipalities have expressed. For example, there's like a, 40-story tower on Douglas Road right now that is part of this TOD, transit-oriented development. And a lot of the people in Coconut Grove feel like we didn't really need a tower that tall. So I wonder if you could talk about how these things could, I understand the impact of, the kind of additions that are happening, but I wonder if there's a way to talk about how it might intersect into neighborhoods? Like, how might this become more granular as well, and kind of be able to be sort of these more sensitive redos? Do you have a thought about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly our focus and what we've been doing in practice, right? It's a difficult balance, when you think of density and intensity and neighborhood scale. So we're taking a variety of approaches to this. One is that we have included new funding to renovate naturally occurring affordable housing. Remember that housing preservation, the age for homes, that's $9 million to focus just on smaller scale developments, right? 40 units or less, garden style apartments that you find across the county to get them up to code in exchange for affordability requirements. What we've been seeing across the county is LLCs purchasing these properties and not maintaining them or redeveloping them. So we worked with the Dade Heritage Trust to preserve one in Little Havana. Again, we're committing new resources to scale this up across the county. We've worked with Aberjane to do a similar development, 19 units in Little Haiti. So that is an element of what we're doing. And in that RFP that I talked about before, we have committed resources just for that small scale development, but also recognizing that our housings are severe and we have to increase density and intensity. I mean, just as when you think about traffic levels, just the level of need that's occurring in the county. I mean, Miami's land supply is completely limited, right? We're wedged between Alligators to the west and Church to the east. We have to go vertically. We have to think more strategically about our underused assets. And the county is one of the largest landowners. So in this public housing site that I've mentioned before, we are taking that sensitive approach because look, these are sites that are underused as of right. We didn't have to even get upzoning for most of them, right? They just were not planned properly. They were monofunctional, they were aging, and we were able to embed new amenities within those sites, again, incorporating resident feedback. So I talked about River Park, but even Liberty Square, right? Oldest public housing developments in the state. We're able to preserve a few of the buildings, got them designated, right? But at the same time, improve the quality of the housing, repair, create a linear park, add school, a grocery store, the first grocery store in Liberty City. So really intentional, again, that included a community benefits agreement that did things around economic development, local hiring requirements, thinking about open spaces, thinking about education, public safety improvements. All that was baked in to this community development strategy. And we're doing this across the county for all these massive parcels that the county owns.
Yeah. So Beatrice is back with one more question here. She appreciates your answer on the ratio between rentals and homeownership, but feels there's more to her question that's not answered, which is like how many and by when, and how it's included in affordable housing policy. And maybe you could extend her question one step further to just talk about how the communities that are affected are engaged in the planning of these projects.
So for any large-scale public housing redevelopment process, there is public input, and again, that's being incorporated in various ways. There's also the ability to influence the design of these rubrics, which I was a former housing advocate of Miami for All. This is a lot of the advocacy I would do is show up to these meetings to really affect the rubric to make sure we're getting the type of development we want to see. Now, as I mentioned before, we're aggressively expanding the supply of affordable rental and workforce housing, right? So we have 4,000 units this quarter. We have 18,000 units in the broader pipeline. We're not doing enough around affordable homeownership. It's harder to do those deals. Land costs are high. There's not a lot of developer capacity. Our infill housing program just has years of mismanagement and inertia. And one of the things that the mayor has committed to do is modifying that program, right? Providing it the adequate staffing that it needs. Again, doing novel things with these RFPs to encourage different types of homeownership. Is the way that we were doing this model before, it's not going to work anymore. It's just not. We cannot continue to build the way that we've been building for the last 100 years. And I think that's really important to think about as we proceed with affordable housing and land use changes. And there's a lot of things that are broken, right? I'm new to the county government, but I think we're taking some fundamental steps to make this process a little bit better. So county zoning is still, it's really old school, right? It's Euclidean, it's traditional, it's like SimCity. You have your residential, you have commercial, you have your industrial, but we have created urban centers that are form-based, right? There's a charrette process. That's really like a good step forward. So our rapid transit zones, I know it's a mixed bag and it's difficult, but you have 30 different jurisdictions. That's a complicated thing, right? That's 30 different mayors, zoning codes.
34, 34 municipalities.
100%. And radically different submarkets, right? Miami Beach is very different than Miami Gardens and Homestead. Hialeah is different than the city of Miami. So you have to be really sensitive to those changes. But what you are seeing, again, more intensity and density along the transit line, which grows ridership, right? It's also a critical part of the affordability strategy. Housing costs is the largest expenditure for most households, but the second largest is transportation costs. And if you combine those two costs, you have moderate income households in Miami spending up to 70% of their income just on those two things.
It's
so
true.
Being more intentional about that, those land use patterns is going to be really important.
So there's another question, which is about who's building the housing. And again, I would take that further. Maybe you could just talk about the process of how something like this rolls out and who gets involved and, you know, how it supports the economy and firms in terms of construction and all of that.
Yeah, so every year the county puts out solicitations for affordable rental and homeownership development. And we have for-profit and nonprofit developers that compete, right? It's a competitive process. You have to go through the scoring process. You have to have capacity. Now, one of the things we do is provide additional preference points to nonprofit developers. And that's really critical. And one of the things that you find in Miami is that we don't have the same infrastructure as other localities for various reasons. So we don't have a robust development sector of smaller nonprofit developers. We're trying to build it. And by providing those additional preference points, we're getting more traction. So in our last RFP last year, over half of the successfully scored applications were nonprofits, which is a big deal. It's something that's not happened before in the county. And one of them was a community land trust, providing long-term affordability solutions for affordable homeownership. So, you know, we provided additional preference points for community land trusts in these solicitations to encourage that type of behavior. And it's a process. I mean, one of the things you find in Miami is because it's so new, because it's so transient, because our affordable housing programs are at the local level are basically used as gap funding for federal and state programs. And those state programs benefit larger for-profit developers. It's a massive inequity. So as a result, what you do is have larger developers that are able to draw down more resources for these large-scale public housing redevelopment projects, but we're encouraging them to partner with nonprofits. We're thinking about ways to increase the capacity of community development groups. We work closely with them in our planning process on these housing plans. And I think one of the ways of really getting to the heart of that is these smaller scale developments that we're encouraging, right? Those 40 units or less developments, which a large group like a Related or Atlantic Pacific is not going to be interested in. Can't draw down enough money. It's not enough economies of scale. But that is really good if you're a nonprofit like the Dade Heritage Trust, right? You can renovate it. It's manageable. You have it after you do a couple of them. You have a track record. You're able to draw down additional resources. And we started that process. So they finished. They drew down some surtax money to do that project in Little Havana. And now in this budget, we dedicated $1 million for them to do another one, right? So it's something reinforcing going forward.
Yeah. Okay. There's another question about, again, Beatrice, on how you control the development costs. And is that something that comes out of your authority, or is there another agency that supervises that kind of thing?
Yeah, it's really complicated. So even the local programs we have control over, there's limitations on what we could the eligible uses, and that comes from the state. In terms of development costs, we try to think of ways of maximizing properties, right? To decreasing the time, expediting the process to make affordable housing cheaper and faster. Yeah. But it's something that we don't do well, right? It's a iterative process. I do think focusing on smaller scale development is a good way of starting that process, right? These developers are churning them out faster as a result. Mm-hmm. We have had a lot of projects that have been stalled because of supply chain issues, which is why the mayor's committed these additional resources and flexible funding to help get those projects to completion. Mm-hmm. So providing flexible money for people who struggle because the cost of lumber and steel and construction increased very quickly. And these projects, the margins are very tight. I mean, it's hard to do in normal circumstances. Forget a massive shock to the economic system.
And so Daniel wants to know, from the construction management perspective, how can we contribute to this mission?
Provide us feedback on ways that we could decrease costs. I would encourage you to look at the solicitations. You can go to the county's website, look at public housing community development, see what their processes are. You can provide feedback, and we'll take that seriously.
And yes, and I think Beatrice is agreeing with you that people need to do that kind of estimate of these things. So one other question that on a smaller scale, and Valerie and Hernan will probably talk about this when they get to their work more, but just before you leave us, George, what about the idea of the accessory dwelling unit, kind of rethinking zoning at the levels of municipalities to allow people to take what are large single family properties that are required to have like 1 unit per half acre or so, and changing that? Do you see that essentially as something that the county doesn't have as much power over because it's controlled by municipalities? Or what do you think about the future of that, some zoning changes?
So we do have some influence, and what I can talk more about is what we're doing on the funding side. So in that solicitation, we did create a $2 million set aside for innovative projects and explicitly mentioned accessory dwelling units as an eligible use. So if you're an owner and you want to add this additional unit, you'd be able to compete for those funds. Now, I think the bigger issue is zoning and land use, right? And the county has looked at ways that we could do this in areas that we do have zoning control. I would just emphasize again that Miami's complicated, so we have this fractured governance structure, and there requires a lot of coordination, and some jurisdictions are against this, but we are baking in more regional planning. We're having regular meetings with jurisdictions to discuss land use, zoning, and affordable housing planning. I think that's really important. We've had regular meetings with the South Florida Regional Planning Council. We have our technical planners meetings. The mayor convened almost all the mayors in the county to discuss these issues, something that had never been done before. So we're moving in those directions. It is going to be, again, a long process, particularly with zoning and land use, but I am heartened by a mixed bag, but the rapid transit zones, the urban centers that I do think are steps in the right direction.
And one last point on that, given that we're facing climate change, we saw the destruction that happened on the west coast of Florida, the tragedy of Fort Myers Beach. Do you see this program of housing also being a way to develop a kind of safer housing for our population?
And that's all it is, right? We're using our housing to achieve all kinds of additional benefits. This is housing that is required by code to be green certified. Our building code is stricter than various parts of the country, which increases construction costs. It's really critical because we know the stresses and shocks, right? Like after Hurricane Andrew, we completely revamped our building code, which is another reason why we've been really intentional about rebuilding our distressed public housing. Again, providing additional resources to preserve smaller scale housing, but also weatherizing single family homes, right? Like making that flexible funding. It is baked in. We provide additional preferences to elevate our single family homes. No other jurisdiction does that.
Right, and you're moving them out of the floodplain, right?
Exactly, yeah. By encouraging intensity and density along the transit lines, those are actually the areas of higher elevation. So it's, again, doing multiple things at the same time through our affordable housing. Even bridging the digital divide, like requiring that as part of the solicitation, right? Being really intentional about what we have control over and how can we maximize these developments to achieve even more social outcomes.
Yeah. And Valerie, you've joined us, so you might have something that you wanted to say.
Oh, well, good morning, everybody. Yes, hi. I've just been listening in on some of the work that's happening down there in Miami, and I think a lot of the direction is very encouraging because it takes, I think, a lot of political will and a lot of vision to help move these types of projects forward, and I think that's encouraging. But I think I also, it's safe to say that there's still a lot of challenges in making these things happen. I think a little bit later I'll be able to share about some of the challenges that we're happening out here in Los Angeles. But I think those are some really great steps. And I think at the base level, of course, it does start with funding, right? I think that is one of the big problems. And maybe I would love to hear from Order. The point is that the money doesn't come from nowhere, right? And so I think the funding sources are always a big challenge for all agencies trying to execute these types of projects.
Absolutely. Thank you, Valerie, for logging in early. I know it's really early out there.
7:21.
So thank you. Really appreciate it.
No worries.
So we're actually running short.
Actually, what I would say, Cheryl, is we're running ahead. Like we are a fast crowd.
We're running ahead because we have a lot of fast talkers. Are there any other questions for George? I can't see from my iPad.
Yeah, no, we got all the Q&A. One thing I might just ask you, George, to follow up on Valerie's point, though, before we depart for a break is, can you talk about the funding sources that make this up and give people a sense of what we need? Because there is the sense that because so much of our county budget relies on property taxes, that the incentive to develop our county is great. And that's sometimes why we're seeing development in places where we maybe wouldn't necessarily want development. And so could you talk about how that balance plays out in funding this kind of work?
Yeah, so we've been, again, this is a priority for this administration. We committed $500 million, unprecedented level of investment to increase the supply of affordable housing. We draw down resources from a variety of different sources. We're entitlement jurisdiction. Of the 30 plus jurisdictions, about a handful receive federal and state housing dollars that they're able to use for affordable housing, county being the largest. We also have local sources. We have a surtax program. We're the only counties in the state that has the ability to draw down taxes on commercial real estate deals to build affordable housing. We created our own affordable housing trust fund that's a little more flexible, and worked with private funders to create a brand new impact pool, $80+ million just focused on affordable and workforce housing. So we've been really strategic about layering these different resources. As we're rebuilding our public housing, we're drawing down federal dollars, rental assistance demonstration program, and layering that with these private and local sources to achieve even more economies of scale. So it's a different layering, but it is, we are focused on this. Like, again, we, on top of the $500 million, we invested an additional $80 million, and that doesn't even capture the entire universe of affordable housing investment that we're doing. This is really a unique moment. We're trying to meet it.
Okay, it's a lot on your plate, George. A lot happening in the county, and we're excited to see a lot of this moving forward. And all I can say to those of you that are on and are wondering, be an advocate. Don't be afraid to reach out to to people like George, or to the mayor's office, or let them know what you think. You can also do that in the ballot box. So, be a vocal advocate and support and encourage and suggest to do things the way they need to be done. And we're happy that that a lot of this is starting. I wanted to, and if you mentioned this, George, I missed it, but there are some really great reuse projects that are going to be happening, mostly in the Little Havana area. But I know the Dade Heritage Trust has a property that they're renovating for low income, and I'm not positive if that's a rental, or I think it'll be a purchase.
It's rental.
It's rental. I don't know if you want to talk about that for a minute, George, because.
Right. So we, in the last budget, did commit resources to the Dade Heritage Trust to renovate an older building, the Little Havana Art Deco building. They got it designated. And in this budget, we gave them a direct $1 million allocation from general revenue to do another one. And again, in our $25 to $30 million allocation that we put out every year, we do have additional set asides for smaller developments to encourage that type of renovation. And we've had Average Jane, Vagabond Group, take advantage of it. She did a smaller scale renovation project, Little Haiti, and we're doing more adaptive reuse projects to provide additional preference points for them. So there's a 1930s era movie theater in Liberty City that's been vacant, and we're going to turn that into a mixed use affordable housing complex, right? Preserving the original structure, turning that into an art gallery, but then adding on top of it new affordable housing units. So we're scaling this up. We're trying to preserve neighborhood scale, through our weatherization program, through the naturally occurring affordable housing programs, but at the same time, knowing that we have to achieve, economies of scale through new construction. So we're doing both at the same time, and I think that's the only way we're really going to address the need in this community.
That's fantastic. I want to thank you, George, for taking time, and thank you for adjusting your schedule. I want to thank everybody for that. We're going to take a little break. It's almost 10:30, so let's come back at 10:45, and we'll leave this on, so you don't have to don't log out and try to log back in. Just leave your computer on, please, and we'll see you in 15 minutes. Okay. Thanks. Welcome back, everyone. Hope you had a chance for a little snack and a cup of coffee or whatever. I've got my my tea here, and we're ready to get into this amazing panel. And I'm going to turn it over to Joanna Lombard, my hero, who just does such amazing work at the university and in our community, and has been a participant with us on Active Design since the very beginning. So I'm going to turn the program over to you.
Well, thank you, Cheryl, and thank you to Cheryl and Marta for keeping active design alive and going. And also for being incredibly inclusive. I think everyone who's attending this as a participant knows that you can reach out to them and join in at any point, and your participation is most welcome. It's super exciting to be able to do this morning with Valerie and Hernan and Liz, like three of my favorite people in the world who are doing amazing work. So I'm going to give just a brief intro, but I would recommend to everyone who's attending that you go ahead and look up their work. Valerie is an architect in Los Angeles, but he also was a student at the University of Miami, a star student, I might add. He's a Miami native. And then he went on to grad school in California, and he's now on the faculty at USC and a principal and founder of DNA Architecture. And there's a really great article on Valerie and Joelle about how he's moved into home ownership and creating an ADU. So although it's not the topic of his conversation today, he'll be able to weigh in on that. Hernan, many of you probably already know because he's been hugely active in Miami. He was working at Dover Cole in the early days. He's gone on to do major urban design consulting. He is a faculty member at FIU. I think you're also doing some things at Miami-Dade and with the high school too, right, Hernan? Not to mention the dad of a high schooler and an elementary school. He and Valerie were both making lunch this morning for those little ones. And then Liz, I think probably needs no introduction because as one of the founders of New Urbanism, a former dean at the University of Miami, head of our urban design program. And Liz was one of the people that I first started doing work in public health. So she and I have done a lot of this public health research on the greenery that we talked about earlier. So with that, I would just recommend that you look everybody up and find out what amazing people these are. What they're going to share with us today, though, is this perspective on healthy housing and various housing circumstances. So I think we'll start with Valerie and then Hernan and then Liz, and then we'll open it for a conversation after. You can load questions into the Q&A if you want to, and I'll keep track of those and bring them up when we open for discussion. So Valerie, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Right. Good morning. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you for such a kind introduction, Joanna. Great to see some familiar faces. And my second home, Miami, I think I'm LA. And that would be my dog, who's also excited about health equity.
The dog heard Miami and was like, are we headed there, Valerie?
Exactly. Yeah, she does travel well. So this morning, I'm going to be sharing some ideas and some of the challenges surrounding health equity, specifically in terms of some of the project types that we've been involved in lately, and that is temporary homeless shelters, and specifically through adaptive reuse and how that sort of impacts health equity. So right now, I think it's safe to say, and this is, I think, probably endemic across the U.S., that homeless populations are a huge challenge in our urban areas. And give me a moment to take Canela. Come on. And so we're going to look at some of the data here. And so you can see here these are numbers from 2020 and 2022. That in Los Angeles, we had about 66,436 people unsheltered and sheltered. I think that's an important distinction because while many people are sheltered, they're still working their way through the homeless system. And then in 2022, it jumped up 4.1% increase. But as you can see, these numbers are staggering, quite frankly. And to the right, you can see some of this data, which is, I think, also very important and will tie into some of the things we talk about later. So we have about 10% who are under the age of 18, which means that we have children who are living on the streets. We also have 32% who are female family units. This is also one that is really impacting, especially women. We have a fair number who are chronically homeless, many who have substance abuse disorders and people with mental illness, and then also, once again, people who are escaping domestic violence. And so one of the things that was noted specifically during the most recent count, the count did not happen in 2021 as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, but there was an increase in the Hispanic Latino percentage, almost 10%. And then finally, that in Los Angeles, African Americans, make up 34% of the homeless population, where in terms of the overall population of Los Angeles, so only 8%. So homelessness really does predominantly, and this is, I think, something that is also evident across the US, affects people of color and certain demographics. We became involved in working in homeless shelters approximately, I would say, 3 years ago. The state of California and Los Angeles have been very active in trying to stem the problem. Part of the issue also stemmed from a federal injunction that was filed because Los Angeles had the practice of removing, let's say, homeless people from public streets. But there was a federal injunction that stated if you're not providing a place for these people to go, then you should not be able to make them move off the street until you can provide adequate housing. And so these are photos of various homeless encampments around Los Angeles. And the image in the center is the typical and traditional temporary homeless shelter that you would find in Los Angeles. And just to quickly give just additional background in terms of homeless shelters. Okay, let me see if I can zoom out a bit. Sorry, there's a question in the chat. I'm afraid I don't know how to do that.
No, Valerie, you're fine.
Okay.
You had it. It was there. It was perfect.
Oh,
What
okay.
Yeah, it's
All right.
good. You can, for anyone who's having trouble,
Mhm.
what you can do is reduce this panel you can just slide the panel of the speaker images and
Mhm.
make that really tiny, and then you'll get the full screen. So you're good,
Okay.
Valerie. Keep going.
Great, thank you. And so that image in the middle really, when we took some tourism, really quite, haunted me is what I would say. And I said to to many people think that we can do better than warehouse these people. And so one of the key things that the city of Los Angeles did, we'll talk about some of the state bills. It was one of the questions or comments that actually came up during the previous discussion, is the city of Los Angeles enacted an ordinance called the Emergency Shelter Ordinance. It's relatively lengthy, but some of the key points of it, this was enacted back in April 2018. And one of the big changes they did in trying to stem this problem was to allow temporary housing in almost every zoning designation. So in other words, zoning designations that previously were not allowed to have housing in them, like manufacturing zones or certain types of commercial zones, were now up for grabs, for lack of a better term. The ordinance, however, was basically set on a 3-year cycle, and the intent there was to allow these structures to go through a normal change of use process, so then they become fully functional as homeless shelters for the future. But as the numbers increased during the pandemic, this shelter ordinance has been extended for another 3 years, and I would anticipate that it could get extended after that, just given the numbers that we're facing, especially in trying to build affordable housing. So one of the things that the affordable emergency shelter ordinance did is it streamlined some of the performance requirements, because another barrier for these types of projects is the cost and the funding sources. So projects were able to essentially meet a sort of minimum performance requirement, which maybe is challenging on certain sides, but I think it allowed the cost to come down. And it also sort of reduced certain fixture counts. One of the key components that was also very important was that it streamlined the permitting and plan check process, which means that these projects could be executed in a very rapid fashion. In terms of the plan check process that was reduced, and many of these projects, and why adaptive reuse was targeted, is some of these projects were built in the neighborhood of 120 to 180 days. Another key component of this, and I was very excited to hear the previous speaker, George, who was talking about these public-private partnerships. This is a key component where the city agency identifies these underutilized properties and acts as a bridge between homeless service operators. And it's a key part of this because what the owner receives is a city-backed lease. So they know that, the building, that they'll get the rent, right, which is a key part of this. And then the homeless service operators, they essentially receive a turnkey project where they can move in and right away from day one, begin servicing the increased homeless. At a state level, there are additional levers that the state of California is using. One of them is called Project Room Key, which has since been phased out to Project Home Key, but both of those projects essentially utilized state funds to provide lodging in motels, ones that typically had lower vacancies. The initial Project Room Key ran into a lot of challenges because sometimes the residents, who are not accustomed to living indoors, would damage some of the rooms, which created problems with owners. So it's now phased into Project Home Key, which provides funds for cities to purchase these motels and convert them into permanent supportive housing. So those are some of the levers that are happening at a big picture. And now what I'll do is hopefully quickly and concisely go through just a couple of the projects that we've been working on, talking about some of the challenges that these types of projects face, pointing out some of the obvious health equity issues that face homeless populations. So to me, it's kind of like a double whammy because you're looking at being homeless, which comes with obviously a myriad of health issues from living on the street, and how do these centers support or mitigate those. So the first one is the Trebeck Center, which is a mixed gender congregate shelter. Typically those congregate shelters are group shelters, which means that unlike permanent supportive housing where people have their own units, they are kind of housed more in a group setting. And typically they're either mixed gender or they'll be single gender shelters. So one of the things that we did, or when working with the city, is we noticed, and this is of course the result of, I guess you could say, NIMBYism, is that some of the site conditions for these buildings, so it's important that we get people into these buildings and use them, but some of them are not located in the best locations in terms of health outcomes. So many of these buildings are located in industrial areas or sometimes by freeways, and data shows, in other words, that the pollutants and air particulate matter in those areas can negatively affect health outcomes. So what's not pictured here, this is a site plan for the Trebeck Center, which was completed in May of this year, is just to the right side of the screen where you see the text is a huge sort of bank of railroad tracks, sort of like an industrial railroad track, where trains going down to Union Station pass by on somewhat regular frequency. So one of the things that you'll get is noise impact, and we'll talk about how we mitigate that. But on the site plan level, one thing that we have found is important and something that we've been able to advocate for is the importance of landscape and outdoor spaces. One of the challenges is that when the budgets are developed for many of these adaptive reuse projects, especially at the beginning, there was little to no budget set aside for outdoor space. Something that we've highly advocated for in our practice is the importance of landscape and its benefit on health outcomes for everyone. So one of the things that you'll see here is along this rear space, we introduced a series of active spaces. The idea is that the residents should have the opportunity to exercise and be engaged with the outdoors. Another important aspect that has been introduced that we've been really excited about is the use of productive gardens. That's element number 5. And so it's been proven through study that when the residents have an opportunity to sort of engage, use their hands with the landscape, it has positive outcomes for them, both mentally and physically. In this image here, you get a slightly better understanding of how the whole building works together, and I'll just point out a few key things. One of the elements that's also been very important is the introduction of mental health support services in these types of buildings. And so these spaces actually, Trebeck Center is actually the first temporary homeless shelter that includes full-time on-site mental health services for the residents. As you can imagine, being homeless is incredibly trauma-inducing. You have people, once again, who are escaping domestic violence, people who are escaping abuse, and having those resources in addition to medical resources is incredibly important. In this project, we also introduced a central axis that, in addition to providing the sort of buffer between the genders, which is a requirement for a variety of reasons by the local municipalities, was to create a sort of biophilia zone in the center of the building that functioned as a sort of interior common area that would provide space for people to connect and have conversations, but to also sort of be bathed in biophilia was the hope. The completed project, we did not get to get as much of the interior landscaping as desired, but we still were able to get a fair amount of it. And so we'll quickly go through some of the images. These are some of the pre-construction images. That the project was funded by the Trebeck Center Foundation. That image of Alex Trebeck was only there for a sort of a media event, so it's since been taken down, but this was about, I would say, 2 weeks before move-in, before some of the landscape had been involved. But I showed this to say, from an adaptive reuse standpoint, these buildings, one of the key things is that they're not designed for residential usage. So one of our challenges always is how to make a building that was designed for storage or a different type of use to be a space that can be inhabited by people. So this is a view of the sort of central corridor or axial space that includes some of the biophilia elements. Originally, we had planned for much larger in-ground planters, but budgetary reasons meant that we couldn't do those. But you can see here that, at least in terms of the design intent, a couple of important things that we were able to achieve is, for example, the importance of natural light. So we try to really open these buildings up because natural light has a demonstrated impact on the interior spatial characteristics. We have started employing color, and this was done through a high amount of research, beginning to sort of understand which types of colors can support sort of mental health, for lack of a word, and sort of trauma-enforced design. Here you can see the skylights that come in and let natural light into the space. These buildings typically have very large floor plates, which means that bringing natural light in from the perimeter is typically not possible. Sometimes these buildings are landlocked on 3 sides. We're fortunate that this one was only kind of landlocked on 2 sides. The sleep areas in these congregate shelters, in a marked contrast from the previous image, I think that I showed at the beginning, where the cubicles, or let's say cots, are just laid out in an open space, is studies have shown that, you know, that semblance of privacy is very important for people as they make these transitions. So residents who come to a temporary shelter typically are meant to stay there for only 3 to 6 months, and then they move to permanent supportive housing. But having this as a transition is important to help them make those steps. Another thing that we try to employ is the importance of transparency. When you speak to homeless people, one of the things that is often spoken about is this notion of being invisible. They get walked by on the streets. We see them, but they're never acknowledged as people. And so in a design standpoint, we emphasize a lot of transparency. Much of this also has to do with operations to allow the operator to see what's going on. But if the image on the left, that's a sort of conference room. And we felt it was important also that, you know, the people who participate and these operators who are incredibly empathetic and wonderful people also maintain a visual connection with the residents on a regular basis. The next project is a family shelter. As noted in the original data, there's a fairly large population of families who are homeless. family units come in a variety of different types. So it could be a family who is expecting a child, maybe a single parent or two parents. And there are also instances where we have family units as many as 6 or 7 who are including a grandparent who are homeless. So once again, one of the challenging site conditions with this project is that it's located directly adjacent to the Interstate 5 freeway. So once again, what we have is sort of noise pollution and also air particulate matter. The floor plan here, one of the differences is in a family shelter, the family unit is prioritized. And so each one of the units, rather than sort of being in an open setting, is put into a sort of closed room so that the family can maintain some semblance of privacy. When you look at the floor plan, of course, these are not large units. The buildings typically have to accommodate a variety of functions. So there's spaces for operators, cooking facilities, job training is a key space along with communal areas. So I do once again want to emphasize that these are not large, spacious places. The opportunity here is to try to maximize the amount of families that can be removed from the streets as they prepare to find permanent housing. All of the facilities include laundry. They get 3 meals a day. Depending on the facility, the meals are either prepared on site or they are delivered from a central kitchen to a warming kitchen here. So one of the things in family shelters that we try to promote, once again, is connection between indoors and outdoors. In this particular instance here, what we did was to open up and create a sort of communal space that you see denoted in the color in the isometric. Here's a more close-up view to it, which allowed parents to sit and observe the outdoor playground area. So when children are playing, it allows them to monitor, but also have their own space. Here are some exterior views of the completed project. Once again, we tried to employ some color. The playground area is kind of just off of view here. These are, once again, sort of construction photos taken just after completion. These are some of the interior spaces where, once again, we prioritize natural light and color in an attempt to work with the minimal budget that we have. Once again, these projects, while they are funded, the numbers are pretty tight. So I oftentimes say we have to make the paint work very hard and be very strategic in how we spend the funds, because once again, a lot of resources are spent in converting these structures from an industrial or manufacturing or storage use into a space that people can live, even if temporarily, and not be warehoused. Because to me, that was a vital part of our participation in these projects. Here, once again, we have a sort of the dining commons, and once again, this emphasis on visibility between the operator and the people who reside in the shelters. And then finally, we do engage in terms of affordable housing in some speculative projects, and we have some projects that are also on the boards that tackle some of these issues of health equity. And one project, we were invited by Los Angeles Magazine to participate in a sort of think tank project about affordable housing. And one of the challenges that many of these projects face, once again, is that there's pressure from residents who do not want these types of projects in their neighborhoods, which oftentimes results in these projects being located in places that are marginal. And I think that is an important, once again, thing to note, that it's sometimes not by design, but the delicate balance that politicians and cities have to play between, let's say, a tax-paying residential base and operators and trying to find the right levers to create affordable housing. But this was a speculative project in which we were proposing to utilize the air rights above an existing light rail system that stretches approximately 14 miles from downtown Los Angeles to Santa Monica, and that we would use the air rights to create affordable housing. The rooftops of these buildings would be utilized for communal space for exercise and roof gardens and things like that. always sort of emphasizing the importance of the natural landscape as an integral part of creating healthy environments. And then this is a typical floor plate. Apologize, this is out of order, but this is for a veterans housing project that we're working on in downtown Los Angeles. This site also located directly next to a freeway, the 110. And here we really, once again, tried to emphasize the importance of introducing plant life and, once again, biophilic elements into the building. So while we're trying to incorporate these outdoor spaces, in addition to sort of some interior things that we'll be doing, like extra filtration on the HVAC, window systems are required to perform at a higher STC rating so that the sound doesn't bother the residents. This is the sort of current concept view as this continues to work its way through the design phases. And so you can see here that there's an abundance of exterior and outdoor space where residents can be out and about, and really attempting to create these moments where the building and the landscape can work together. So in closing, in the specific aims of creating a sort of active and health equity environment, the first would be that sheltered and unsheltered homeless also need to have a fair opportunity to be as healthy as all residents of Los Angeles. This shouldn't just be something that we prioritize from other citizens. Also, it would be great if as cities we could identify sites in less marginalized areas. And I know that there was all challenges, but it would be, I think, an important step forward. Health equity also includes mental health. Many of the residents in these places are suffering, and so increasing funding for mental health services in these types of projects, I think, is also an integral part. Create additional opportunities for outdoor engagement. As I alluded to earlier in the next line, that some of the budgets for these projects prioritizes just the build structure, and we cannot emphasize enough the importance of people being able to be outdoors and engage in that. And then finally, just to increase awareness of the impact of the built environment on homeless populations. And I will leave it at that.
Valerie, thank you so much. You have covered an amazing array of topics that we're going to come back to. And for those of you who have questions, you can put them in the Q&A and we'll take them up after all three panelists have presented. Hernan, if you are ready to present, you can take over the share screen and step in.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. And I don't know if you prefer, I should have asked you this, Valerie. I mean, I know in doing these kinds of talks, typically everyone has their camera off except for the person who's speaking, because it's kind of easier for the audience. But if you're feeling you're just out in space with no one listening to you, and you want us to see us listening, just let me know and we can turn our
All right,
cameras
thank you.
back on.
It's just a reminder to when I was teaching for a couple of semesters.
When everyone had the cameras
yeah,
off. Oh,
yeah,
sorry about that.
But
Yeah.
thank you. No worries.
I should have thought that. Hernan, do you want us to stay on camera, or are you good off?
Either way, it doesn't bother me either way.
Okay, we'll take it up just so it's easier for the people who are squishing all the pictures over to the right, so that they just see your slide as big as possible.
Sounds good. Let's see. I wanted to speak about three main topic areas that I believe affect our ability to increase active design or designing for activity in our cities. These three factors, I think for those of you that are familiar with them, partly are indelibly interlocked, right? Parking requirements have an impact on density, which also have an impact on maintaining an active retail or mixed use main street, right? But I chose to start with parking requirements. But before I explain why, I also wanted to contextualize this kind of concept of equity when we're talking about active design guidelines. I think it's important to remember this is a tool that was developed by the Center for Neighborhood Technologies in Chicago. It's the Housing and Transportation index, which basically assumes that if we all agree that housing has become largely unaffordable in the city of Miami and across the country, right? This is a national and some would even say an international issue. That when we add also the costs of transportation to housing, it really gives us a real picture of what the real cost of living in the city is for most people, right? So this housing and cost index tells us, zooming into the little table there, in case you weren't able to see it, that the combined housing and transportation costs across the board on average are 51%. So they make up 51% of people's typical costs. To put that into context, the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development states that anyone paying over 30% of their income towards housing is cost burdened. Anyone paying more than 50% of their income towards housing is severely cost burdened. And so we typically talk about the cost of housing. Here you can see it's averaged at 32%, which would indicate that the majority of people in Miami are cost burdened. And if you didn't factor in transportation as, you know, a necessary cost, which I believe in Miami is inextricably tied, right? Now, once you compile housing and transportation as 51%, you could kind of begin to understand how many people are severely cost burdened. And so I want to start off with the parking requirements, right? With this beautifully designed building in the center of downtown, where we see what the impact of not eliminating parking requirements within a gridded downtown area of our environment, which has historically been fairly walkable, to supplant that with this new reality where the majority of our high-rise condo buildings sit on a plinth of at least 5 to 8, even 10 stories of parking. These pictures are basically to illustrate how parking has become a really interesting typology and how parking can be applied in different ways. This is an example of different parking garages that have been centrally located, which would typically reduce the need for some of the neighboring buildings to have that parking. And to kind of contextualize the issue that we are having with parking, this level of fare that we have with the automobile nationwide, I'm showing you these couple of pictures taken from Strong Towns website that are highlighting where parking structures and surface lots are. So if you see this picture, you can see how our urban environment in these pink areas is overburdened with parking spaces, right? And this is something that became very apparent to people during the pandemic as people were forced to work remotely. We began to realize, well, what happens to these spaces, right? And we began to understand that perhaps we have overly committed our built environment to these parking spaces. It's a picture of downtown Austin, Texas, right? And I can show you, I could do the same thing for Miami. I could have done that in this picture here. This is a great picture of downtown Miami, where you can see the beginnings of some of these parking structures, the parking plinths, as well as the Metro Rail and Metro Mover, or really Metro Mover here, and Metro Rail as well. Okay, and what you can see is happening in a lot of this new construction is that this is now a picture of 17th Avenue in Allapattah, where you can see the historic kind of typology here is a mixed-use structure that lines the corner. It does have this kind of international modernist aesthetic with the brise soleils here and the kind of attempt at a ribbon window on the ground on the second level, which are typically offices. But on the ground level, wrapping around the building are a bunch of small businesses. And next to it, you can see a new building. This is on 17th Avenue, Northwest 35th Street, where I find this kind of ironic or interesting as a tool. I'm noticing that, you know, one of the benefits of Google Maps, they do have that street view option that allows you in certain cities to go back and see what existed there. You know, even up to, I think in Miami, it's up to 2013, maybe even 2008. But I found this really rich that this new building, I believe this is passing off as mixed use. But those of you that are familiar with this type of construction understand that this new ground floor is dedicated now as the space for the homeowners association for this building and any services for the building itself. Ironically, what Google Maps has done for us, and I basically pointed my pointer over this one before I took the screenshot, it still shows you the tags for the existing businesses that were there. And kind of an ironic one, I didn't show this one, but the one that's over here, if everyone can see my cursor, is for a barbershop, and it says temporary closed. I don't think it's coming back. But this is just to point out that as we are rebuilding our new built environment, that we need to make sure that we're preserving the things that enable us to have walkable environments. And so sticking with parking requirements as illustration of parking lined with other services made by Dover Cole and Partners. This is consideration within the Miami 21 zoning code, but also something that was detailed and a part of the hometown master plan for South Miami, which includes some parking structures off center that reduce the parking requirements for the surrounding buildings. Here I have a picture of Sunset Place, which is a mall that also has a major parking lot that businesses around there can rent spaces in there so that they don't have to park, in front of their building or require the surrounding buildings to have a length of parking. This is the 7th Street parking garage on Miami Beach, where you can see that you can still make sense of the parking structure behind the commercial structures here. And then the parking garage itself is lined with green elements. I'll get back to this point in a second, but you could kind of begin to see how that begins to tie into the notion of density here. I'm showing a picture of Chicago to think about density, right? And these are some pictures that I took earlier this week. This is at the intersection of US 1 and 37th Avenue with the Platform 3750 project right there that Georgia La Paz was referring to earlier, a project that is supposed to have a certain amount of affordable housing units. When we think about the connectivity of the project, right, this is across the street from the Douglas station. And so that bridge has been there for a really long time. As a resident of Coconut Grove, I can tell you that there are some people that use it. Many people do not use it. Many people choose to just walk at grade level. And so again, parking requirements, how are we prioritizing parking over the pedestrian? And here I believe I may be missing a slide, because here I believe I'm supposed to be now talking about density. So I wanted to take a pause on parking requirements for a second and point out, now start talking a little bit about density. And so here, also staying Coconut Grove, I'm showing a picture of a project that Joanna Lombard referred to before. This is the 40-story building at Douglas Station that she was referring to. I've taken it here from just outside Varick Park, so you can see the typical kind of typology of Coconut Grove, the cottage kind of style, 1-story, and you can see that monstrosity behind it. This would have been the kind of typical footprint of the wood frame houses. This is what is now being allowed to be built, taking courtesy of the Miami Herald. Some of you may now know this typology as the Sugar Cube homes. And so when we talk about density, it's interesting because this is downtown Coconut Grove, where we can see condo buildings. And what's important to understand here is that we are three blocks away from a Metro Rail station here. And at a time where we have a major housing crisis, right, and where we have, again, a very walkable footprint in this neighborhood, rather than considering the increase in density as other cities like Portland have done, we're committing our spaces to these single family structures, maybe duplexes that are really not doing much for walkability or design. You can see that the parking garages, that the parking is prioritized in the front of the building, right? And so as I talk about each one of these, I want to leave you all with some best practices. Many of you may be familiar with the best practices coming out of Portland, where Oregon, where they have eliminated single-family housing as a use, citing that was one of the most discriminatory typologies that was created in our country. And what they're saying is not that people cannot retain their single-family houses, but they're allowing for a mix of typologies up to a 4-story walk-up or fourplex, right? They would not allow a condo tower on these blocks, but it's the idea of increasing the amount of density that you can have in these blocks by allowing anything from accessory dwelling units to be built to duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, and even walk-ups. This is an illustration of that was designed by Gensler of future Metro Crenshaw, which I think is interesting in terms of the idea of maintaining complete streets. However, you know, as a longtime fan of hip hop, right? When I think of Crenshaw, I don't think of this. And so I think that here, where we're preserving perhaps the walkability and thinking about the complete streetness of the image, I wonder how we are dealing with the diversity and ensuring that we are retaining as many of the historic residents of these communities as possible. And so with that, that will bring me to my last and third point, which I think is really critical and inextricably tied into both of these topics of both density and parking requirements, is the idea of maintaining an active retail frontage in any type of mixed use, right? And I would add to that, which also has to do with density, properly scaling these businesses, right? Something that is happening in a lot of these developments, like the development at the Coconut Grove station, following the development at the Dayland station, is that one of the anchor businesses there is going to be Target. Now, I don't personally have anything against Target, right? They are a great community partner. They give a lot of grants. They funded much of the work that I did in places like Brooklyn, for instance, when I used to work for a business improvement district. So they are aware and in tune, typically, and maybe it's different by region in terms of what's happening on the ground and wanting to be good community partners. But I really have to beg the question of why do we need so many anchor kind of commercial developments that are so large? Again, you count the stops between Coconut Grove Station and Dayland Station. Is a Target really the best thing that we could have done? Or could we have potentially tried to retain small business footprints in buildings? And so here I'm showing one of the new buildings that was designed on Calle Ocho, where I think they're doing a fairly decent job of at least bringing back certain retail facilities. There's a Wells Fargo on the corner, there's a T-Mobile there, and if you walk further down the block, you will notice that in this kind of arcade that is maintained at the ground level, you still have a mix of small businesses, contrary to some of the stuff that we're seeing in other places. This is a very interesting development here happening just behind the Douglas Station, where you can see this picture. I really have to question what it is that is happening in terms of enforcement. And again, we're seeing at the ground level is just so, it's kind of ironic, cynical, perhaps. I see it as this pedestrian pathway, which really kind of leads to nowhere. If you look across the street there, that will lead you to another street. When I think of these kind of pedestrian spaces and pedestrian malls, comparing them to other places and cities, I would expect to see a bunch of businesses, right, lined around here. What about the newsstand, the little juice bar, the little coffee shop as you walk on your way to the train station, right? The train station, which would be behind this image. Notwithstanding, also notice the missed opportunity perhaps to put utilities underground. And so I'd like to kind of, as an aside, also mention that with a lot of these large developments that are happening, right, that and this one I don't believe necessarily included much affordability. What some of the municipalities are doing is allowing developers, in lieu of providing affordable housing, to contribute to what's typically called a community benefits agreement. And so in my mind, that seems fairly narrow-minded, short-sighted, perhaps, when we are not retaining those elements that we've already ascertained are the key elements of neighborhood design. So here you can see, and also missed opportunities for innovation, right? So knowing how we're in a very precarious situation, how we're frequently referred to as ground zero for climate change, we have a missed opportunity here to try to redesign our utility scheme, right? This is some massive electrical poles here that are obstructing the pedestrian path. Here's best illustrated by this picture. I mean, you know, pictures worth 1,000 words. And again, going back to these pictures of Allapattah, you can kind of see what I'm referring to. A small business footprint allows, you know, small business has been the cornerstone of economic development in our country. So it really strikes me as odd, both from an economic development perspective, that we're not maintaining that footprint, as well as how it ultimately affects our overall physical health, right? And as well as quality of life. And quality of life, when I think we talk about equity, it's important to not talk just about physical equity, but also mental health. I'm sorry, not just physical health, but mental health. And what are the mental health impacts of, you know, displacement and gentrification, for instance? What kind of impacts do those types of development, which I believe this type of development encourages certain type of displacement, certainly the commercial displacement, right? You can see at least 1, 2, 3, 4 icons of businesses that no longer exist, at least in this place. And it would be interesting to follow up and see if they even exist anymore, right? So you've destroyed the economic vitality for a couple of entrepreneurs, and you've also eliminated all the pedestrian-oriented services that used to line the street. And so I think it's important to contextualize some of the stuff. This is a paragraph that I'm taking from Richard Rothstein's Color of Law book, really great little book that talks about the history of kind of regulations that have brought us to the place of inequity that we find ourselves in the United States. And particularly citing the development of housing, it says that actions of government in housing cannot be neutral about segregation. They will either exacerbate or reverse it. Without taking care of doing otherwise, exacerbation is more likely. The federal government now operates 2 large programs to address the housing crisis faced by the poor and near poor, most of whom in many metropolitan areas are African Americans. Without an intent to do so, each program has been implemented in a manner that deepens racial segregation. One, the low-income housing tax credit subsidizes developers whose multi-unit projects are available to low-income families. The other, the housing choice vouchers, popularly known as Section 8, subsidizes families' rental payments so they can lease housing that they would not otherwise be able to afford. It further goes on to say, in the tax credit program, communities can veto developers' proposals, something that officials in middle-class areas don't hesitate to do. Many policymakers urge developers to build in already segregated neighborhoods in the hope, usually a vain one, that their projects will revitalize deteriorating areas. Developers themselves also prefer to use tax credits in low-income neighborhoods because land is cheaper, it is easier to market new apartments to renters in the immediate vicinity, and there's less political opposition to additional housing for minorities and low-income families. These conditions ensure that tax credit projects will have a disparate impact on African Americans, reinforcing neighborhood segregation. An analysis of all tax credit units nationwide, completed through 2005, found that about 3/4 were placed in neighborhoods where poverty rates were at least 20%. In regards to Section 8 program, landlords in most states and cities can legally refuse to rent to tenants who use housing vouchers, although a few jurisdictions prohibit such discrimination. The voucher amount is usually too small to allow for rentals in middle-class areas. And so what this results in is an exacerbation of the gentrification at the same time that we see the construction of these large residential projects with these large footprints for parking. You see, now you can see here how the parking requirements here play into the density. This is at the Brownsville Transit Station. You can see that the surrounding footprint for the rest of the neighborhood is small. Also here, this speaks to what I just read about in the Richard Rothstein chapter. Brownsville, like Liberty City, is an area that still has many small vacant lots. You can see kind of like the vacancies around the footprint. And furthermore, I would add that there is no commercial footprint on the ground floor of the station. I didn't place a picture of this here, but the same is happening at the Northside Transit Station with the development over there. And this is Liberty Square, the recent redevelopment where we see the parking is at least centralized and it's wrapped around a little a playground. But you can see that there's no commercial activity, within the footprints, the ground floors of these buildings. And so this is maintaining a pattern of residential land uses disconnected from commercial uses, which tend to contribute to the lack of income that is historic to these communities. And let's not forget that this was done by design when we redlined the majority of our cities. And so to speak about, I think it's important to speak about all these issues as we're all responsible for ultimately, what we are left with as a city, right? Architects, planners, the developers that finance the work, the city officials, the code enforcement building officials that are supposed to enforce the existing guidelines, right? To ensure that we get the type of built environment that we deserve. And so with that, I wanted to point to the example of the city of Denver, which this was from 2019, where this article cited that the city of Denver was to select a design build contractor for the 16th Street Mall project. I believe what Richard Rothstein is speaking to in terms of referencing LIHTC is who is building, right, the new spaces that we want. Is it large developers that are beholden only to their bottom line return on investment, right? Or can governments also require through their regulations to commission these projects in a different way that will yield something closer to what we deserve and what we value, right, in the space, thinking about active design, where we want to have spaces that are designed for us to be able to be physically healthy. Just a couple more slides here. This requires partnerships with national foundations. In this case, there is kind of a trifecta of things going on. There's great leadership in Denver. There are also great partnerships. Different than us, where we also are developing these great partnerships and connections to people. They also have the benefit of being one county and one municipality, which is really the challenge for us locally here when we understand that, Miami-Dade County is one county, 34 municipalities in large areas of Dade that are still unincorporated. But here you can see the approach that was taken, kind of surmising what the landscape is of transit, all the transit lines, and understanding what is happening at each station, and then deciding that they would try to ensure that within the transit corridors and near all these new stations, that we would have a mix of incomes in terms of the units that are available, as well as a mix of uses. And I wanted to leave you with these couple of images about the importance of maintaining that small business footprint on the ground level. And to further point out that sometimes it takes some advocacy groups like small business organizations, nonprofits, to work with with the architects, engineers, and urban planners to ensure that we retain these spaces, right? And this is possible. This is local here. This is Geralda Avenue, where you can see the different small businesses that are here and how people are enjoying the space. This has really been a transformational project for Coral Gables. And with that, I think I've spoken enough.
Thank you so much, Hernan. You've raised a lot of issues and good questions that we need to address. So Liz, we're going to give you the next 10 minutes and then we'll open this for conversation among the panelists and then among the people that are joining us. So if you're ready.
Okay, hold on a second to get this. All right. Do you have that full screen?
Not yet.
No?
No, you just need to click your slideshow thing one more time.
Hold on a second. No?
Hmm. Okay, you know what? Maybe just just slide that panel over and it'll
Yeah.
be okay. There you go. We'll go with that. Okay.
All right, so good morning, everyone. What interesting, great presentations. Here I am at the back of I'm supposed to be on slide 1. What interesting presentations and topics that I would love to speak to, going backwards, but just going forwards in this presentation then. I have 5 slides, so this will go very quickly, and it's about specifically addressing issues of health and its various aspects in housing. And much of it is perhaps theoretical, but I'd like to be showing examples of how we apply these. And so starting with an example of one project that I worked on in Tavernier Key. This is a HUD-funded project, tax credit project, which is a 1-story party wall courtyard scheme of 80 houses, giving ground level access for children, seniors, and handicapped residents. Lots of windows, courtyard skylights, views, ventilation, daylight, and so on. And of course, one very important thing was fitting into a surrounding neighborhood. This represents a number of projects that we've worked on in which we tried to make them seem very much that they're part of the place, and not, even if they're receiving funding, that they're not somehow so obvious. Many people stop by this project asking whether they can rent or buy, because there's a little office there, and I think a lot of people are very pleased with that outcome. But moving on to all of those components that you try to incorporate in a project like that, I have a few slides that show how, again, out on the West Coast, which seems to be ahead of us in many ways, and perhaps a good model for what we might do better here in South Florida, from Mattoon, where we have a number of friends working as designers and architects. Some of the examples of thinking, taking the thinking through from, let's say, some of the data or knowledge that is established about health and the built environment. And so here's a diagram which is trying to help explain all of those different components, many of which you heard in the prior presentations, but healthy housing is only part of a series of determinants for good health. There's the environment, transportation, the maybe sometimes hard to define social cohesion, that kind of social support network, the infrastructure that we just heard about, and the economy, likewise, in the way that Hernan might have spoken about it. And these all are determinants for factors in health outcomes. The built environment, the social, economic, and environmental context. There's always individual behavior, obviously, and healthcare. And what we're looking for as a result is wellness. It might be reflected as shown here in length of life or quality of life. To a little bit more detail, I have notes. Again, the same kind of elements: housing, transportation, social cohesion, the environment, the economy, and infrastructure, and how these might translate through a community prioritizing what aspects of these are important to them, to a specific project response, the number of units, accommodation of shuttles and bicycling, the kinds of open spaces, adding community gardens, job training spaces, and so on. I think one of Hernan's points about allowing the incubation of businesses with housing, when housing is so fully programmed, as you see in the new buildings, and there is no space for someone to be able to open a repair shop or a nail shop or start a catering business, for instance. That housing that we're building could be much richer in those ways, contributing to economic health, of course. And so where did those kinds of determinants and factors come from? Well, there's a lot of research. Joanna's really our local leader on this score and could tell you a lot more about it. I've participated in a kind of peripheral way. But one of the most obvious things is that greenness in the public environment can be a very effective contributor to wellness. And no surprise, it's possibly the only thing or the closest thing to a silver bullet for climate change mitigation that exists. And so the impacts on health of greenness, the walkability of an urban environment, academia can generate this kind of data and looking at existing conditions and comparing different situations, the health of seniors or children, given the different environments they are living in. And so generating this data then gives us the kind of confidence to say these are determinants and these should be included in design and maybe policy. And so how we deploy them as practitioners becomes important. So this is an example of another project I worked on with an affordable housing provider. And this was in the case of a HUD RAD project. HUD is now rehabilitating some of the public housing that was built in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. They were rebuilding it with Choice Neighborhoods and Hope 6 and other programs recently, but now they're focusing on the ones they want to maintain and rebuild. And so we took some of these determinants and elements and said, here is how they might play out on a large scale housing site relative to anything from the scale of the neighborhood. You can see at the top, if you can see my cursor, in the neighborhood, at the level of the site, at the specific building, which might have several units in it, and then in the unit in particular, perhaps its interior. And this speaks to providing maximum opportunity for access to destinations. So that issue that Hernan brought up of mixed use, of course, is very important. People first mobility, enabling mobility for additional and a larger trajectory of access. And that begins with walking, of course, but then accessing multimodal opportunities, but also understanding that there are wheelchairs, service animals, bikes, baby prams, and so on in the design that might be dealt with. Places to gather, I think this is where social cohesion and social and mental health comes into being, because it's connectivity which promotes that kind of well-being among people. Some of the medical school people that we've worked with all introduced us to the term of interdependence instead of the kind of autonomy that seems to be a watchword of modern times, giving people everything they need. The idea that there might be interdependence among different age groups and different abilities. And that plays out in the public realm. So it's not just the sidewalk. Those places where you see loitering really might be imagined as could be served by small parks like Domino Park and on A Street. But other kinds of things which we're not accustomed to putting into the urban environment. And I think the others here are obvious: eyes on the street, greenness, transparency, comfort, and good light and good air. And then whether they are achieved by design or policy, we've seen some beautiful design examples in the first presentation, and Adnan was pointing to design shortfalls, but a lot of it, or some of it, could be done in the policy. Those, the affordable housing, by increasing density, that density should be increased only if the additional housing is affordable, or if some of these well-being factors are included. So I think I'll stop here because we've spent a lot of time presenting, and maybe there's some discussion that people would like to have.
Thank you so much, Liz. That's great. So Hernan and Valerie, if you want to come back on screen, and Cheryl and Marta, you could join us too. I think that I have one question for you all to start, and then we'll open this up to everybody else. So you can start typing in your questions in the chat, and then also questions for each other. I think it's better if this is more of a conversation than like a, I don't know, Jeopardy show. So one of the things that strikes me about all of these—
Hollywood Squares.
Oh, sorry, Hollywood Squares. Yeah, whatever. You can tell I'm not really a good game show expert here. One of the things that I was really struck by, though, is the integration of life into just about everything that all three of you have talked about. You know, Valerie, everything that you pointed out, the biophilia zone, daylight, transparency, and connection, we're finding that these are extremely important in healthcare, you know, for hospitals to work, for fewer patient errors, for healthier patient outcomes. We're finding it at the scale of neighborhoods. We're finding it at the scale of communities. Hernan pointed out, rightly so, where there are these juxtapositions that are, in fact, could be not only beneficial, but harmful. And then Liz, you've given us some strategies for like, well, so where does this fall as a piece of policy? Where is it something that the architect can do? So I wonder if each of you could just take a minute and tell us, like, what are the leading partnerships? Because it's clear as architects, we can't do this all by ourselves. So if you have to say, you know, who are the most significant partners along the way that are helping us to create the kind of places that we're talking about? Cheryl and Marta's active design guidelines, that's a really powerful policy tool. How can we as architects, who should we be engaging? Like, who's your top person? And Valerie, since you were first, we'll start with you.
I think policy is so important. And I think just using the example once again, at least in Los Angeles, of the emergency shelter ordinance, it was just by tweaking a bit of policy that allowed certain project types to move forward. So I would say, as architects, you know, engaging with our political leaders, it's not very, let's say, it's not always fun, right? It doesn't seem like the most exciting activity, but it's a key role if we want to have a seat at the table and really shaping how cities evolve and grow. And so, at least to me, yeah, it's definitely the policymakers, who's the people that we need to, you know, be at the table with.
Hernan, do you agree?
Yes, I agree. The policymakers definitely have to be at the table. But I find that it is also through the agency, you know, of individuals and professionals, you know, typically through a shameless plug, you know, little organizations like the AIA Miami or the Miami Center for Architecture and Design, that has served as a place for having this dialogue, for having this conversation. That can also serve as an educational tool. So I think that it really requires all facets of society where the policymakers play a really important role. We also need the political leaders, right, to at least lend their ear and to, you know, try to you know, have goodwill to listen to people, and avenues, you know, kind of for that two-way street, right, of transparency from the government as well as communication, from the residents and stakeholders, right? To be able to have this dialogue about, hey, this is what's happening to us,
Mhm.
what do you think that you can do? How can policies affect us? And vice versa.
I would add one thing to that. Yeah, I think the policy is important because I'm not sure that the companies that we work with that develop or redevelop affordable housing, and especially subsidized housing, would do some of these things if it wasn't already written into the policy. But
Exactly.
there's also, and then, we represent the design, but I think the third leg of the stool is management. That's my mantra: design, policy, and management. And
Mhm.
Valerie spoke about the homeless service operators. They had to be willing to take care of the plants or take care of the larger facility that has the playground or the community garden. And
Mhm.
so I think in terms of, and that's a very broad picture of many varied partners. But I think that's a kind of education and benefit picture that needs to be probably talked about all the time, because people forget, and then there are new people all the time. And policy gets put into place, and it's there at least for a while. And the designers maybe need to hear it over and over again too. But I think that's maybe some of our roles is assuming that we need to talk about these things all the time, not just
I
to
agree with that.
people know
I
them.
agree with that, Liz. I believe the management needs to be baked into the design.
Well, Valerie, did you know the managers of those facilities when you went in to say redoing the Skateland, or did you have already a partnership with the people who manage that, or did that come about as a result of the project?
Well, that's an interesting question. So essentially during the design process, because the city has not actually contracted with an operator yet, then there is a sort of communication buffer because sometimes the city is negotiating with different operators. And so it is kind of challenging, because the best we can do is sort of operate on sort of best practices and our experiences and arguably missteps on other projects to kind of mitigate that. And so in short, and to follow up Liz's point, that is a big part of it, is because you have to have an operator who is actively engaged in taking over this project, right? Because at the end of the day, we just draw something and we leave, right? Or you specify something, but it really is up to that. And so one step that we've done is that we typically will visit a facility at 6 months and a year after. And we talk to the operator to understand better what is working, what doesn't work so well. It's like, oh, apparently the kids never go on the bouncy thing. Good to know, right? These sorts of
Right.
things.
And then do you make changes?
It's
Sorry,
not going to
Lynn.
be it's not going to be government. I think that's what I was trying to get across is, they may take care of the streets in a minimal way, but if you add anything else, the trees or the extra place to sit, or somebody else has got to deal with that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I was going to say, I think it's also trying to figure out the right word to use, but maybe ownership, right? If you think of, let's say, the Underline, for instance, or many projects require a champion, right? They require somebody to ultimately kind of take the reins, coming out of the gate, and that, takes ownership of that project, right? And not just through construction, but through its operation as well. And that's kind of what I meant by, I agree with what Liz is saying, right? It does require all those three elements, right? Design, policy, and management. And I think the management needs to be baked into the design. Another way to look at it is what's baked into RFPs and RFQs, right? Typically,
requests for proposals and requests for
sorry,
qualifications for students who may be on the call.
Qualifications for development, right? For a development project, right? Let's say for a public housing project, the municipality will put out a request for proposals, right? For development on this sites, and they'll give you the proportions and the dimensions and with what budget you have to work within and all those kind of things. And you can bake a lot of things into those requests for proposals that should typically result in those elements that you want.
Well, you're raising something. Okay, so this is a question that maybe is a bit of a controversial question, but we saw, George showed us the kinds of projects that we're building in the county. And because the theory is that we don't have a lot of land, although we actually do have a lot of land, it's just dispersed. But understanding that for a moment, and the cost of land is high, that for sure is true. And therefore there's a tendency to go vertical with this kind of housing. Liz, you've made the point over the years that high-rise buildings are some of the most expensive buildings of all to maintain, and that for ongoing maintenance and management, having buildings that people can manage themselves is really practical. And there's a third part to this, which is some of the studies that we've done when we were doing our work on greenness and elders. We have found that elders do best when they live on the lower floors. Their health outcomes are better in lower floors. And then Valerie, the projects that you've done, they're like a manageable, you could know everybody in that compound. And there's something about this sort of 350 as a number of people that we can kind of know in an organization or an institution. So what I wonder is if you all think or have a thought about the kind of vertical profile for a project that is entirely affordable. Like, how does that work from your perspectives? And Liz, since I put you on the spot by saying you had said that to me in the past, I don't know if you would still say that now.
I understand that the system of providing affordable housing is incredibly complex. And if you want to do really any number of units, you're going to have multiple funders, and the developer is juggling many sources of funding, many types of regulations, and potentially expensive real estate. Now, just one aside, we're making, right now, our governments, both the county and the city, are scaring up all the land they own to try to develop, to deal with the housing crisis. And I'm not sure that it's being considered as relief for affordable housing. But there's some interesting things going on. The school in Brickell that's going to have 10 teacher units in some housing that's being built on the school property that's going to reincorporate the school. I don't know the project really well, but I suspect we could be more demanding of those projects. At any rate, to get back to your question about the high rise, I think if we want it interspersed, and given the fact that market rate housing is high rise in Miami and luxury housing, then and if we want affordable housing interspersed or close to other people, then I think we really need to be doing that, whatever we think about that as a good way to live or not. The alternative, which is the Liberty City model, we've done a whole bunch of that tax credit stuff, and it's all around the edges of the county. It's in the far northwest, it's in the far southwest. It doesn't bring people any closer to their jobs necessarily. And that was the prototype because it was a cheaper or less expensive way of building. But it's always, I gather, like 200 units at a time. There's a kind of threshold that the brain damage of doing it, and as well as the financing structures require. And so whether that gets spread out or going high rise, I think maybe more of an issue of geography and where you want it to be than anything else. And of course, if it is if you are close to downtown or close to the transit stops, of course, then that's a good thing. But I'm not sure how much of that's being built right now, the new tall buildings, whether we're taking advantage of that to say those should be affordable. Just one more thing. We have an affordable housing benefit in Miami 21, the old fashioned bonus. And nobody's counted how much of that has actually produced. And I think that's one thing that it's a research project, I think, for data people, not for the designers so much, but it could be very helpful to have that data for our town to
Mhm.
understand how whether policy has been effective.
There's your next project, Joanna.
I never lack for
It needs to be
projects.
funded. You know, all of research is funded. It doesn't get done out of the goodness
Some of it's
anybody's heart.
volunteer, right, Marta? Yeah,
Well,
no,
I
that's
think
right.
another interesting point about this is I think it's interesting. Sometimes it's always thought of as, you know, you only have one or two options, right? Which is we build towers
Mhm.
or single family residential. And I think that there is a vast sort of mid-range is what I would call it, where there's a lot of opportunity. And I think Hernan, for example, you talked about how in Portland and these areas, for example, they
Yes.
basically have gotten rid of single family zoning. In California, there's been some controversial discussions around a state bill that was passed called SB 9, which essentially, well, I guess, yeah, people call it the single family residential killer, right? The same idea, which
right.
is now that with your single family lot essentially could be developed into a 4-unit property.
Right.
And so the concern for many people is that, you know, my next door neighbor or developer is going to swoop in and turn, you know, my house and right next door into an apartment building.
Mhm.
And so I think we have to balance the concerns and the, I often say fear always comes from a real place, regardless of policy. And so you have to balance that resistance from homeowners in the single family sector to kind of want to push density to other places. And at least in my opinion, I think that there is a sort of moderate development that can not negatively impact certain areas, sort of more incremental fashion. So you can have these sort of watershed projects that give you 800 units or something, but that there is a place for accessory dwelling units or somebody taking a single family and making it into a duplex.
Right.
But ultimately, I think in my vision, the big challenge is whether or not these quote unquote become affordable, right? Because that's always been the discussion here in California. If you just make more housing, it's
And,
going
you
to
know,
become affordable.
I would point you to the book that, and articles that Patrick Condon in Vancouver has written on the topic, saying that increasing the supply is not necessarily going to increase the affordability. It's not a supply and demand equation anymore because of the financialization or commodification of real estate. And that if you do add any density, it should be only under the condition that it is affordable. If you want to have it, because, you know, if it's a anywhere near nice neighborhood, if it has any kind of high value, it's not going to, just by adding units, you're not going to end up with affordable housing there. Anyway, I'm not the right person to argue this, but Patrick Condon, I recommend to you.
Oh, no, I agree 100%. And that was what I was saying. So even with these incremental models, it hasn't, you know, it doesn't equal affordability. So what I think we've seen is there's more of these things happening, like accessory dwelling units, but it's not like these things are cheap, you know, where suddenly, you know, people are moving in, the people you might want to most benefit. It's still out of the reach for many people.
It's true. It's
I
not.
would add that. I would add that. I don't think. I'm sorry.
I'm
Go ahead.
sorry. No, I was just going to say, even, you know, so many people are talking about container homes, affordable, but they're not. They're expensive to convert. So we have to. I think the discussion about, you know, high rise and mid rise or small units, we have to find a way to kind of force context, you know, through zoning, and we need to push the, you know, changes to allow ADUs around affordability, not, you know, but you're right, Liz, that if it's not codified, if it's, you know, most developers, if it's not, if they're not required to do it, they're not going to do it. You can't blame people for wanting to make money, but you you have to put the right ordinances in place to make sure a lot of this stuff happens.
Yeah, I was gonna add that I don't think there's that I would agree with what everyone is saying. There isn't a one size fits all
Fits all.
solution for this. And I think it does need to be contextualized. So I think that these strategies for densification don't necessarily apply everywhere, right? I think
Exactly.
they apply closer to, for instance, I would consider neighborhoods in close proximity to Metro Rail as being, you know, neighborhoods that could be ripe for allowing for these allowances, and that they wouldn't, you know, they do need to be codified, but they don't necessarily need to be mandated. I think that
But you
the
know,
other thing I would
Hernan,
add there is
Mhm.
that we do need a diversity of developers, and I know coming out of the nonprofit, you know, community development space that I worked in for some time, that, you know, that ecosystem is really struggling across the nation, right, and particularly in South Florida, where there's a lot less you know, nonprofit development capacity
Yeah.
across the board. And that notion of kind of the community development and coming at development from a different place. And I think there's a misnomer. Nonprofit does not mean not making money. You
Yes,
could just contextualize
right.
it as, you know,
Yeah.
Well,
getting a
Beat-
product and still making
Beatrice-
money in the process, but maybe not having to maximize, you know, a return on investment.
well, Hernan, you showed a perfect example of that when you showed the project in Coconut Grove and the street, the kind of little dead street.
Yeah.
And Beatrice has weighed in with, I guess, more of a comment than a question, but the low rise, high density, mixed use urban space intermingled with small shops. So maybe, I think if we take what you're suggesting to us, if the policy could extend to preserving neighborhood character in the way that you showed, ensuring the presence of these small businesses, and if those could begin to occupy that ground floor, when you showed us the kind of dominance of the parking facade versus the people on the street, even to the extent, like, we've gotten good at the liner on the first floor, but what you're telling us is when you go 10 stories up before you see a human face, that's a problem. So maybe there is a kind of analysis that we need to bring to this. And I think you illustrated for us a place where we could try it out, right?
Thank you. I think it's it's you know, a financially feasible model. There is money in operating a parking garage.
Yes.
You know?
That's for sure. Okay. Well, I think we don't necessarily have any more comments or questions. I don't know, Cheryl and Marta, if you want to wrap it up. Hernan and Valerie and Liz, I just want to thank you so much for your insightful presentations. And I'm glad, Cheryl, that you're recording this so that we can share this with students and with people beyond. And Hernan and Valerie, you could share it with your students too. So thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Joanna. Excellent moderator as always, and with great ideas. Liz, Valerie, and Hernan, I can't thank you enough, especially Valerie, who braved the early morning, although you have kids, so you get up early. And a dog. And a dog.
That's right. Early is my time. Yeah.
So it's great to see all your presentations. Thank you.
They were wonderful. So I want to encourage you, anyone that's still on, to, if you're interested, to participate with us in some of these discussions and in our housing affordability work and other projects that we're doing around the built environment for MCAT and AIA. I wanted to also thank Marta, who has been amazing in being the project manager for our Fit City work. And I couldn't have done any of this without her. But I'm really proud of the work that we're doing in Fit City, through Fit City and in our active design guidelines. So you'll be seeing more information about that. This will be online. We will post it to first to the activedesignmiami.org website, and then it will also be on our YouTube channel. And yeah, I think it would be great to show students, but not just students. You know, there are a lot of people that could learn from this. And I just wanted to say, does anybody have a last comment, parting words? Anything, Marta? Oh, can't hear you. You're unmute, yeah. I don't know, maybe your sound is turned down.
I
Anyway.
think she's saying it was a wonderful session.
It was a great
And she
session.
hopes everybody volunteers to help out with active design, right, Marta?
I was gonna say it's a great session, and yes, let's promote these active design guidelines. Please help us get the word out.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
See you soon. Take care.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.